Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the One Vote Conference. My name is Mansi Verma, and I am one of the trustees of Article 21 Trust, which is a co-organizer of the One Vote Conference with Hasgeek. Article 21 Trust works at the intersection of technology and welfare. And in the past, we have intervened on through advocacy and otherwise on issues like Aadhaar-based exclusion and privacy concerns, personal data protection, non-personal data governance, technology and justice, one nation, one ration. And participating and coming on board to organize this conference is also an extension of our mandate. Specifically, Article 21 Trust will be involved in organizing, curating, and organizing the rights and access track of the One Vote Conference, which will be held on 25th January next year. I would also, at this moment, mention that today I will be facilitating this discussion along with Mr. Sunil Bajpai, who will be joining in a bit later. And very quickly, I will offer an introduction of Mr. Bajpai as well, though many of you would already know him. So Mr. Bajpai has extensive experience working with the Indian government, shouldering responsibilities that have spanned across engineering, research, operational and policy-making roles. Specifically at TRAI, Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, he led the work on net neutrality for India, and he has also been instrumental in leading the adoption of distributed ledger technology, or what we call blockchain, for controlling spam and fraud communications. With this, I would now invite Sankarshan to provide an introduction for the One Vote Conference.
Hi, I think this would be a good time to introduce the One Vote project, a project we started in order to examine the effects of introducing technology like blockchain in voting. So we started off with trying to focus on the consequences of bringing in new technology, but we soon understood that we needed to widen the scope of how we examine and limit ourselves not just to blockchain, but include other technologies that have been proposed. For instance, facial recognition or biometrics for voter authentication into voter rolls and all of that. And so through the webinars, the sessions that we create, our aim has been to try and unpack the complexity of technology and make it easier for our audience, some of whom are not technology savvy, some of whom do not understand the entire gamut of issues around this, to be able to evaluate the choices that are made, to be able to understand whether those design choices are based on sound principles, whether proper public consultation has been happening, and to be able to bring forward an easy framework, easy to adopt framework by which new technology choices and various proposals can be examined, evaluated, and discussed. We do the One Vote effort in collaboration with partners like the Article 21 Trust, Pivot, who are also engaged in raising awareness around topics of inclusion, exclusion, rights, the consequences of voting, issues around voting, democratic principles, and all of that. The One Vote project has focused on bringing together experts who share their findings, their work, and engage in conversation and participations. We grow through the efforts of our community, our supporters who provide us with financial support. And so if you're interested in contributing and joining us, the details are on our project page. Do please reach out to us. We hope that you would continue to engage with us, participate in our conversations, be present in all the discussions that we are doing, and read the output of and the content that we produce. And certainly, through all of these activities, be able to realize in far greater detail and in great richness the issues at hand when technology is introduced into seemingly simple topics like voting. Voting is one part of a democratic process. Elections are contests. And to be able to understand in great detail what changes are brought about through these proposals is what we intend to do through One Vote. Looking forward to your participation, engagement, and your support to our project in the future. Hi, I think this would be a good time to introduce.
Sorry, Mansi, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think almost all of us have been there, done that. Okay, so very quickly, taking ahead from the introduction that Sankarshan gave about the One Vote conference, I will very quickly mention for all of us who have joined us on Zoom and all of those who have joined us on the live stream that the expected takeaways from this conference are that we are hoping that those who will stay with us in this conference will be able to acquire an understanding of a way to evaluate technology-based solutions which have already been introduced or might be introduced in future in the voting process and elections, and along with that perhaps develop a better understanding of the attributes of the data involved in elections and how it is very intricately linked to the rights of the voters. I will also very quickly, because we'll now directly jump to our first talk of this afternoon, but very quickly before that, I will mention the meeting etiquettes a bit. So this event is being organized in a meeting format. So all of you who have joined in with us on Zoom, I'd request all of you to please keep yourself muted while the talk is going on. And also keep your cameras off. While the talk is going on, you are free to add your questions or comments, if any, directly to the chat box. And at the end of the talk, I will be taking them up and putting them to the speaker. The videos for the which are being recorded right now of the talks, they will be released later after the conference. So with that, very quickly, we will now jump to our first talk of the afternoon, which is by Shivam Shankar Singh. And a very quick introduction, though Shivam and I also have a long association going back to the time when both of us were LAMP fellows. So Shivam is a data analyst, campaign consultant, and author of the bestseller How to Win an Indian Election. As mentioned already, he started out in politics as a LAMP fellow, that is a legislative assistant to a member of parliament, and went on to witness the process of conjuring political realities while managing data analytics for some of India's largest political parties. He is also the co-author of The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities, How Information Warfare Shapes Your World, which has come out only very recently. Today, Shivam will be speaking about how data transforms elections. Very briefly, in his talk, he will be touching upon how the new age campaign methods use data extensively to build campaigns and to shape the thoughts of voters. While on the face of it, this might seem innocuous, but it also enables profiling of voters on caste and community lines and can lead to disenfranchisement on the basis of those identity factors. So his talk will explain some of the ways in which political parties use data in their campaigns and how that would manifest in the world of electronic voting and blockchains in elections. So with that, Shivam, I quickly invite you to please initiate your talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, Shankar-san, for having me over on this very important topic. I would actually like to start out with a few stories. And why these stories, they're not related to e-voting or blockchains at all, but they give you a perspective of what kind of problems are there in the Indian democratic setup. What are the kind of problems that elections face when you actually go on the ground and campaign? So I will not name the states, I will not name the political parties, but these stories are essentially there to make you understand what are the challenges. And then we'll go on to evaluate how technology fits into the framework. Uh, so in one of the constituencies, one candidate essentially gave 5,000 rupees to 50% of the voters registered in that parliamentary constituency. It's an absurdly huge amount, and it was about 10 times higher than the next candidate on the list. That candidate won the election. In another part of India altogether, politicians realize that even when you pay someone, it's not necessary that they would vote for you when they're inside the voting booth. They could take money from you, they could take money from the other side and then vote according to their wishes. Because we have a process called secret ballot where no one really knows who voted for who. Your ballot is secretly cast inside the voting booth. What people did and what a political party did in this particular region of the country is that they realized, okay, these people in these specific communities are not going to vote for me. So I am actually going to pay them to not go vote at all. Because once they're there, I don't know who they voted for. But because the election commission marks your finger, it's very easy to tell who voted and who didn't. So people were paid to just sit at home and not vote at all. Uh, Another really interesting incident is while actually surveying people in a constituency, we met a lot of people who talked about a party affiliated with their caste group and their religious group. And people were very certain that, okay, we don't care what really happens on the development front. We really don't care about the infrastructure. We feel empowered when this party comes to power. Our community feels empowered. In a democracy, is that empowerment at the cost of, say, development a good thing, or is it a bad thing? Is the person exercising his free right to choose whoever he wants in a democratic setup, or is voting on religion and caste just because he feels a sense of pride, just because he feels that, okay, this party is my caste group, and he decides to support them? uh, Another very interesting thing that came up during surveys a lot is that a lot of people base their entire opinion on who they would vote for on entirely incorrect information. Like the facts were entirely wrong. People would believe that, okay, this state's GDP has like crossed the national average, even though it was the worst state in the country before. These kind of informations mostly reach people through the political garters. Now it reaches through social media and WhatsApp and these different sources. And there's a really famous saying stating the essence of a democracy survives with a well-informed electorate. If the electorate is misinformed, if they base their decision to vote on facts that are just not true, then is it still a democracy? Uh, One very scary thing that has come up multiple times is that videos have come out from different elections, and this happens especially during local body elections, where there is one person inside the polling booth and he presses the button for other people. So old people go to vote, they're standing in line waiting for their turn comes. Uh, Before they're about to vote, someone else presses the button on their behalf for obviously his political party and the side that he supports. So these kind of elements have entered polling booths. If you look at the history of India, booth capturing was a very common thing where a political party using just brute force took over an entire polling booth, stamped all of the ballot papers, or just pressed all of the buttons on the EVM continuously. Ballot paper was much faster because you could stamp a lot of ballot papers and shove it into a box. EVM is slightly slower because it's rate limited. After every vote, there is a certain amount of delay, and another button needs to be clicked for the machine to get reactivated. So it's slower, but these kind of things still happen in a lot of parts of the country. So these stories are essentially to tell you what challenges we face. Now, what has happened is that two major things have transformed in democracies all over the world, and they're challenges that everyone is trying to figure out how to deal with. No one has a good response. One challenge is essentially social media and the interconnectedness of the world, where everyone can present their own facts. So while we were writing the second book, The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities, we realized there is no such thing as an objective reality anymore, because your reality is based on the information that you consume, the information environment that you live in. In this kind of a climate, if I control all of the information that you see, because I know how to target you better on social media, I know how to target you over WhatsApp, I know how to target the people around you, and I can shape their information. they will start to believe it once they continuously get information that reinforces a certain narrative or reinforces certain facts and figures. Even the data that people have is not factual anymore. Every side has its own data. So this transformation has happened essentially because of the penetration of the internet to even the remotest parts of the country. A lot of people believe that smartphones impact just a very small percentage of the population because very few people have smartphones. But the very interesting fact about this is when we went to villages to do electoral surveys, we realized that the arguments on WhatsApp reached much beyond people with smartphones, because whoever has a smartphone saw those arguments and then used them while discussing politics with others within their village. So they used those arguments at the local chai ka dukan. They used the same arguments while working with other people, or just sitting under a tree in the evening. So the WhatsApp arguments reach other people orally. This is a major transformation. The second major transformation that has happened in Indian politics now, it started in US politics about 30 years ago, is just the amount of data that political parties have and the way that they use data. In essence, a political party is trying to figure out how your vote can be converted to their favor. What do you require for this? In the US, they started out with analyzing people's likes, analyzing people's thoughts on different issues. Okay, if you support gun rights, who are you likely to vote for? If you support liberal values, who are you likely to vote for? Even if you support something very obscure, like a specific football team, who are you likely to vote for, and how that football team can be used for messaging to convert your vote. So they did some of these obscure experiments. The scary part about India, though, is that it is a lot easier to do because caste and religion in general works very well out here. So you don't even need to know the person's individual preferences. You don't need to know what issues they care about per se. You need to only figure out what the caste group as a whole cares about, what can be used to convert their vote, what the religious group cares about, and what can be done to convert their vote. And then you need to develop a mechanism to get the message out to them. How does this mechanism get developed? That essentially happens because the electoral rolls are public records. So whoever is eligible to vote, their names are on the Election Commission website right now. This data gets converted into Excel sheets. From there, it gets linked to different data sets which have your phone number, which, because we don't have a great data protection law right now, phone numbers are not even sensitive data under, say, the IT Act or any other legislation. So selling them and buying them is not illegal at all. A lot of you might have gotten a lot of messages from companies that you've never interacted with, or even maybe your local MLA or MP has called you through an auto dialer before the election and said, please vote for me. How did they get your number? How did they know that you live in their constituency? It's essentially because your phone data was mapped to your electoral data. This forms the basis of how targeted messaging happens. But here is the very interesting component. This is not it. It's your caste and religion gets analyzed, your voter roll gets linked to phone numbers, but then any other data set that is available. This includes, say, how rich or poor you are. How would a politician know this? Right now, one of the best proxies for urban areas is something like the electricity bill. And a lot of the discoms actually have websites where you just need to enter a bill number to get the electricity bill out. That is how poor the data security here is. So essentially, you can just write a script to go from, say, the number 1000 to 99999, and it is going to literally download all the bills running a very simple script. And this is true of even Delhi, surprisingly. Like we tried the North Delhi Discom website, and it's still the same. I had actually collected this data 1.5 years ago. I looked at it right now to see if like it's still the same. All you need even right now is just your bill number, and you can figure out what your neighbor's electricity bills are. Why is electricity bill so important? One, they give your exact address, they give your phone number, they give your name. So these things get correlated to the voter roll very easily. But they also tell us, okay, this person is rich because he probably has air conditioning, he has more lighting, he has more rooms. That's why he has a higher bill. If you have a lower bill, if you have something like, say, if you follow the free electricity bill criteria of the Delhi government, then it can be said reasonably that, okay, you don't have too many appliances at home. You're probably not running, say, a heater and a cooler and a fridge 24/7. So these things become very important, because then specific messages tailored to that socioeconomic group can be sent by specific political parties to just that group. And this matters a lot in elections. Even if you have the best message in the world, if you don't have the mechanism to deliver that message, your entire great message and your entire great idea is essentially useless when it comes to the democratic process. So, okay, we've covered some stories on how elections get manipulated, and we've covered what kind of data political parties use. But how does it connect to something like, say, e-voting and blockchains? I'll start with one research that we did while writing the book, and that is essentially we looked at what cyber criminals did to get OTPs out of people. So you know the one-time password that you get for bank transactions and for sending money from one place to the other, or essentially any online transaction that you do these days, you require a message that comes to your phone number. And people intuitively understand that, okay, this number is supposed to be secret. This number is, I am not supposed to give it to anyone else. But a lot of things in India fell into place at the same time, where cyber scammers realized they could create excellent scripts to get this number from people. So a lot of the first cyber scams that started for getting people's OTP essentially started with people calling people, others, and they bought these data sets. So they already knew where your bank account is, they knew your bank number, they knew your name. So they called very authoritatively. Okay, is this speaking? I am calling from this branch, and you haven't linked your Aadhaar to your bank account. And if you don't do it right now, your account is going to get blocked. When this kind of a thing happens to someone who really requires their account to draw their monthly wages, who have like 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 in their account, that person is going to give whatever OTP he has very fast, because his experience of working with the governmental system and especially PSU banks is so bad that he would be very scared of an account getting blocked. So cyber criminals use this, and as soon as they got the OTP, they transferred all of the money out from that account using, say, payment wallets. Uh, this also affected a lot of very wealthy people. The script was different. They were promised some great prize and to share their OTP if they wanted to receive it. And a lot of people fell for it. So this is the level of digital security consciousness that we have in this nation. And this is honestly the level of security consciousness that the entire world has right now, because all of these things are new. And one big problem that we had was OTP was supposed to be for bank transactions, but now everybody wants an OTP. You go to someone's building and they have like a building registration system which sends an OTP. You go to a lot of these tea and coffee shops and they send an OTP. You basically want to like eat at certain restaurants, they have a loyalty program that sends you an OTP. So we have normalized the sharing of OTPs constantly, even though it's supposed to be something sensitive and secretive. This connects to e-voting in the sense of, if money can be stolen from people's bank accounts by themselves, them revealing their OTPs, then it's very likely that a vote will get stolen too. This can be something that is a major pitfall when we think about a process like e-voting. Uh, Though, why do we care about, say, blockchains and e-voting at all? What is the problem that we are trying to fix here? The things that we talked about: cash getting distributed for votes, religion getting used, cars getting used, people capturing entire booths by physically going there. What kind of a problem does e-voting solve? What kind of a problem does blockchain solve? I realized that there are three things that any technology in elections can do, going from, say, the least effective and the one that we should care about the least to the most. The first thing that technology can do is make elections faster. So the voting happens more efficiently. Lines get like inside voting booths faster, and they exit voting booths faster. The results come out faster. Why do I say this is something that we should care less about? Essentially because it is our democratic duty to essentially vote for our representatives who are going to represent the country for the next 5 years. I don't think it's too much of an ask for someone to stand in line for 1 hour extra, even 2 hours extra, or for the results to take 5 days or 10 days or 20 days. How does it matter if an election result comes out in 2 days versus 20 days, when the people who are voted into power are essentially going to be controlling things for the next 5 years? So I don't see it as a major challenge, but it is something that technology can potentially improve. The next one is making elections cheaper. So in what sense do I mean cheaper? For political parties, there probably isn't much that technology can do to make elections cheaper, especially because the introduction of a new medium like social media does not cut down on other election expenses. Initially, when this entire phenomenon of Facebook and WhatsApp started in 2012-13, I actually believed that, okay, this is going to reduce electoral costs because parties now have an easier way to reach their audiences. But what happened was they had to advertise here, they had to build huge content farms and teams and units that would create WhatsApp groups here. Plus, they had to continue to do all of the activities on the ground that they were doing. Rallies have not stopped. Filling buses with people to get them at the rally venue has not stopped. Hoardings and posters and pamphlets have not stopped. Autos and video vans have not stopped. All of it is there. Social media has just added onto it. And it is an external, like extra cost. TV advertising still happens, newspaper advertising still happens. So elections have essentially become more expensive because of electoral technology. If you look at something like 3D hologram or new campaign technologies, then it's only added to costs. But how can technology make elections cheaper? Essentially, it can do it through the election commission. If it reduces the cost of, say, overseeing an election, if it requires less vehicles, less people, then that might be beneficial in some ways, but also not a very important consideration considering elections in a state happen every 5 years, at the national level happen 5 years. We should be spending some amount of money on democracy. Like, just to ensure that an election functions properly, if we need to deploy some more resources into the election commission, even in the sense of people monitoring, say, fake news on social media, hate speech on social media, then we should, as a democracy, be deciding that, okay, this is where we want to place resources. Maybe we will give less newspaper ads on how successful a government is, and we would spend some more money here. So resource itself is not a very big problem when it comes to the election commission, and even when it is, resources with the government are completely available. Technology to reduce costs, at if it harms any other component, it's not really worth it. So what is the thing that technology should be doing in elections? In essence, I believe there is only one thing, which is making elections fairer and more democratic. How can technology make elections fairer and more democratic? Uh, One such thing, say, as Shankarsan mentioned early on, facial recognition and biometrics for voters, it could potentially, like, people could say that, okay, a lot of fake voters vote on the behalf of others using their identity. So if you have something like facial recognition or you have something like biometrics, then that might prevent it. The problem here, though, and our experience looking at Aadhaar enabled PDS distribution, was that a lot of the times the machine just fails. You try to authenticate someone's fingerprint and it just doesn't work at that point of time. If this happens in an election, if the person is not able to vote, they're sent back home. You have essentially taken away someone's democratic right. You have taken away the right that they have as a citizen of India. The most basic kind of right that they have here is the right to vote. And you've taken that away because, okay, your machine didn't take their fingerprint in, or your machine did not recognize their biometrics, and the facial recognition system didn't work at that point of time. This could be a potential challenge one. Second thing, problem that I see with this is that it is also very susceptible. In a country like India, it's entirely possible that these systems exist, but there are also bypasses that exist. A lot of the times, you must have seen this on social media, that a lot of people got an OTP for someone else's vaccination, and then the vaccination happened too, and the certificate got generated without you ever sharing your OTP. So this has happened to so many people that there is obviously some sort of a backdoor built into, say, the vaccination system, where the OTP registration can be bypassed and the vaccination certificate can be issued regardless of the person sharing their data with you or not. So these kind of challenges, if they happen in a democracy, they reduce faith in the democratic system a lot. And once that starts happening, it's a risk for the entire nation's setup. And the basis of the country gets damaged if the faith and trust is damaged. So technology, when it's brought in, we must recognize that it should work perfectly before it comes here. It cannot operate like a startup where we are going to experiment with it. We are going to try it. The second thing with something like e-voting, if it is something like what's happening right now, where you need to go to a voting booth and press a button, except it's electronically connected, that is just adding an additional risk factor because things get hacked. Connected systems are easier to break into. If everything is a standalone machine, if every EVM is a machine on its own, if someone wanted to hack it, they would have to go to every EVM. They would have to go to lakhs and lakhs and thousands of booths. One MP constituency has like 2,500, 3,000 booths. MLA constituency has 500, 600 booths. So to reach that many booths and hack that many EVMs is a very difficult thing to organize logistically. But say if this was on the internet, and if people could access that network and they could hack into the system, then essentially an election could get stolen. But if you have e-voting where the person doesn't even need to go there, if it's say blockchain based, but they can do it on their own phone or they can do it from different terminals, what comes in here is that if people's secret ballot is essentially taken away. What is going to happen is that politicians are going to build their own booths where they're going to be standing outside, paying you money and looking at, okay, are you voting for me or not? And this was the argument against postal ballots. So personally, like looking at the US, I studied there. Anyone can request a postal ballot. You get it to wherever you are at that point of time, and you can vote in your home state too. So you essentially vote for whoever you want to. You fold it up in an envelope and you post it, and they count it as a normal vote. In India, postal ballot is essentially only like defense services and people who are working in elections who can't go and vote during that time. Why was this not extended to citizens? I wanted to understand this, so I talked to a lot of people. And I realized essentially these ballot papers will get bought. You request a postal ballot, it comes to you. Political parties will go out to major constituencies and they will just say, okay, I'm going to give you the money, you give me your ballot. I will fill it up for you, I will send it in. You just sell it to me. So this kind of a threat gets created in the ballot setup, which can also exist in e-voting if the person is doing the voting outside the confines of a polling booth managed by the Election Commission. Another thing that technology has created now is that it's easier to recognize who votes for you and who doesn't. We have booth-wise voting data available in something called the Form 20, and a booth is 800 to 1,000 people. So we know right now how these 1,000 people voted across every booth. So when political parties look at data like that, they know, okay, this booth, 80% of the people didn't vote for me. Out of these 1,000 people, 800 did vote for me. Who are these people is very easy to identify because then you look at the voter roll, you see what community they are from, what caste they are from, what religion they are from. You start understanding, okay, these are the groups that are against me. Now, the challenge comes in that these groups can very easily be disenfranchised. In one state, they actually deleted names of particular people that they realized weren't probably not going to vote for them from the electoral roll. They did a revision and they updated it, which the Election Commission is supposed to do anyways. But they did it in such a manner that a specific set of people just lost their right to vote because they no longer had their name on the voting roll. They found out when they went to the polling booth on the election day, they handed over their voter ID and they were told, okay, your name is not there, even though the person had been voting at the same booth for like the last 15 years, the last 20 years. So these kind of challenges come in when you have this kind of data combined with power over democratic institutions. So how does e-voting help this? How does blockchain help this? How does it create a fairer election and a more democratic election is the only consideration that we should have. Faster elections should not matter. Cheaper elections should not matter. In my personal experience, I have not found a great use case where e-voting and blockchain would help elections. On the other hand, it creates a lot of risks and vulnerabilities. So just because of this, and because the current system is working reasonably well in the voting process, we have a lot of challenges in this democracy, but they don't come from the voting process itself. From what I have seen, it comes from the way elections are conducted. So we start to address that is how we make a better democracy. And technology seems like a panacea for a lot of things. We are like, okay, we are going to eliminate fraud, we are going to eliminate risk. But first you have to evaluate how much fraud there is, how much of anything is happening that is wrong, that can be fixed with these technological solutions. Very interested in the rest of the speakers of this conference because I have also been trying to learn how blockchain and e-voting helps the electoral process. So happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Shivam. So one of the questions was, how does the idea of the seated ballot get affected? And I think towards the end of your talk, you managed to answer that question. But I think while you were speaking, a couple of thoughts which came to my mind. And while I wait for other people to share their questions on the chat, I'll just very quickly share a couple of my thoughts as well. So one was that, I mean, I've also done some work with politicians, and I think a lot of politicians take pride in the fact that they know their constituency very well. They know their constituency, the makeup of the constituency, the communities which are living there like the back of their hand. And earlier, I think this understanding would be developed by actually spending time in the constituency, being on the ground among the people. But nowadays, you can develop all this understanding from the data itself, and as you've mentioned, all the data that you can gather from all these many sources. So I think it's just the very understanding of a grounded politician who knows the constituency very well has been turned around on its head, and now it's a politician who can remotely know all the data about their constituency and still not know what's happening in their constituency. So that was one thought that sort of like came to my mind. And the other was with respect to trust. So at the end, when you say, that people are still coming out and voting, so they obviously, trust the electoral process, even though they might have a lot of distrust of the politicians, of political parties. But I think, given the fact that despite everything that you mentioned about EVMs and all, there is still conversations which happen after every election. EVMs have been hacked, and all of the conversation led to VVPATs coming in and everything. Do you think the usage of technology, which, as you mentioned, that it could be hacked, it could create perhaps even more distrust among the voters with respect to the voting process? So if you could address that one question. And then the other question from Mr. Barun Mitra is, exactly. I mean, something similar about how voting on EVM can be manipulated at the booth level. So so if you could answer those two questions.
So just commenting on the first part, completely agreed. A lot of the politicians who were very grounded understood their constituencies because they spent a lot of time there. That has transformed, but there are two reasons for it. One part is, okay, they can do it remotely. The other component to it is actually that a lot of the candidates don't matter anymore. A lot of the elections that get contested at, say, the state level and the national level. And the national level leader and the state level leader has become more dominant in recent years. One third part also is that constituencies are much larger now than they were, say, 30 years ago. So reasonably, you could expect a politician to see like 1 lakh people in his Lok Sabha constituencies. At the constituency's size of 5 to 6 lakh people just in your constituency, it's almost impossible to get to know people. And there are a lot of politicians who really try but aren't able to make it to even 10% of their constituency in their 5-year term. Coming to EVMs, there are two parts again. The first part is, I have never seen any evidence that's conclusively shown that EVMs are being rigged or are being hacked. I don't personally believe in the theory only because they're unconnected devices. Every individual EVM can be susceptible to hacking, but to do it at mass scale, you would require people going to the EVMs physically and doing it. And I, as someone who's worked in politics for the last 5-6 years, I've like ran teams who conducted surveys over like 250, 300 people. I don't know if I can find even like 20 people to go to booths and do something like this without them coming out and claiming credit for it. We would have thousands of people right now in the country claiming, oh, I hacked the EVM, that's why this politician won, if this was being done at scale. So I don't believe it is. Is it possible to hack one single EVM? Yes, it is. I actually had a computer security professor from the University of Michigan who did hack into the EVMs. He can't enter India anymore, but there is a very interesting paper on it, on how he did it. So individual machines are susceptible, but at scale, it's not happening. Though the argument for why EVMs exist and why can't we use ballot papers are also not great ones. Essentially, it's only about time. It's that, okay, counting ballot papers takes too much time. How does it matter if election results come in 2 days versus 20 days is something that I haven't understood yet. Considering the person is getting elected to run the country for the next 5 years, I think we can spend 20 days extra waiting.
Okay. There is also a question that somebody has shared on the live stream. This is, how can blockchain be used in election?
There are a lot of ways to do it. Why we would do it with blockchains, there isn't a great answer. But technically, every individual voter could be on the blockchain, so that whenever anyone is deleted and added somewhere else, like you can verify that, okay, this individual identity existed there, it was cancelled from there, and it's been placed somewhere else. So what this does is it prevents someone from having their names in 2 or 3 different voter rolls, because a lot of people have it in their villages, plus they have it in the city that they're living at now, and it's very difficult to eliminate these names at multiple places. If it's on a blockchain with every individual voter having like one identity, it'll be very obvious, okay, your name went from here to here to here, and it will be a perpetual record. It does create some privacy concerns, because then people know exactly when and where you've moved across your entire life on a perpetual ledger. So your life and movement can be tracked. But yes, that is one use case. Another use case of blockchains could potentially be something like just the tallying of results. So right now we issue physical certificates. If you put it on a blockchain, then it's immutable. No one can change the record and things like that. Once it's entered by the official, it's permanently there. There's no question of anyone changing anything. But returning officers, when they sign the certificate for a candidate getting elected, representatives of all the candidates are there in the counting process. So if this was a problem, if some fraud was happening at scale, there would be huge hue and cry right now, which isn't there, which leads me to believe it's not too much of a problem.
Okay, couple of questions have come in. Another question is there a tech solution to increasing voter turnout?
So yes, sir, there is, but it comes with risks. As I said, the US had such great voting during COVID, also because they allowed for postal ballots for everyone. Anyone could request it, they got a paper at their home. In India, it is slightly riskier because those pieces of paper will get sold. I am 100% sure of it. When votes get sold, then like why would ballots not get bought by political parties? We would literally see like booths and kiosks, like literal shops where they're like, okay, you can sell your ballot here. That's going to happen. So that model of increasing voter turnout, probably not a great thing. What could potentially be done for voter turnout increase is using technology to make registration much easier. It should be very easy for someone to register themselves to vote at a particular booth. If I move from here to another place, I literally have to find an officer and request him, sir, please insert my name here. That process, they put it online, but even like a lot of people that have done it for, they keep getting rejected based on, okay, we don't like this ID, we don't like that ID, get it changed on your Aadhaar, then we'll put you here. So making that setup easier, if someone wants to vote in one particular place because he's changed residences, it should be much easier. Second part that I see for voter turnout increase is obviously like information campaigns about why voting is important for your democratic rights. But that is something that the educational system should handle instead of, say, the election commission.
Right. And I think this will be the last question for this talk today, which is that does a government in power have any advantages because of the use of tech? Things like control over the machine or its maintenance, or getting into contracts for the machines or the software, or is it the election commission which is completely in charge of contracts for EVMs, etc., or is the government in any way involved there?
So the government in power has a huge tech advantage when it comes to data collection. Like a lot of the governmental scheme data, a lot of the lists that get compiled for governmental schemes are essentially also used for politics. So if there is a party in power, they obviously have access to it, while the party who's not in power, they likely don't have access to it. Even when they do, they have partial lists here and there. They never have the entire database. If you look at what has happened in, say, Telangana, then they're trying to create the profile of every household in the state that maps the household's income and caste and this and that. So it's essentially the government collecting all of the data that the political party could ever dream of. So this kind of a thing, this access, yes. When it comes to the machine itself, there isn't an advantage to being in power versus not being in power. What you do have is more control over the people who manage elections. So in general, my belief is that still the most vulnerable component of an election is the people. So how does a booth get captured? It gets captured with the consent of people who are designated to protect it. It doesn't happen that someone's just taken it over it because they have a technological advantage. It's that they had control over these people. So that component needs to be addressed. Yes, technology could potentially have a role there where every booth could be live streamed and anyone could see any booth. That would make things easier for, say, political parties to keep verifying what's happening at every booth. Are the lines functioning fast or slowly? Very interestingly, one thing that happens during elections, political parties know which booths are not favorable to them. So they do a lot of things to slow down voting in those booths. And they slow it down so that some people will get frustrated, not vote. Some people won't be able to vote because it's now too late. So less votes will get cast at those places while you try to speed up voting at the booths that are favorable for you. So things like this getting live streamed could help.
Okay, so with that, we come to the end of this talk. Thank you so much, Shivam. It was extremely interesting and enlightening, I'm sure, for everyone who has joined us on Zoom as well as on live stream. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we will quickly move on to the next talk of our conference today, which is going to be by Dr. Subodh Sharma. A very quick introduction. Dr. Sharma is an assistant professor and Pankaj Gupta chair professor in privacy and decentralization at IIT-Delhi. His recent research investigations have been in the area of system security, data privacy, and blockchain. He has co-authored several papers and opinion pieces on the topic of blockchain, public bulletin boards for integrity of elections, and and electoral rules. Today, he is going to be speaking on, as you can all see on the screen, designing electronic voting systems, some considerations. Very briefly, his talk will focus on key invariants that one must keep in mind if they are working on crafting reliable and secure electronic voting systems. He will also discuss some electoral voting over the internet and whether or not it is desirable. As with the previous talk, if you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat, and which we will take up at the end of the talk. Thank you so much. Dr. Sharma, please take over.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mansi, for the introduction. Like you mentioned, this talk is going to discuss rather some of the design considerations in implementing digital voting systems, electronic voting systems. And I must thank the previous speaker, Shivam. He pretty much covered everything that I wanted to cover in my talk, albeit in a much simpler and nicer way. So my presentation would mostly be the formalization of the ideas that Shivam spoke of, primarily for operationalization purposes of electronic voting technology and such, right? Now, why these properties are important? Because election security concerns are ever present, as very nicely put by Shivam. And this could be due to interference by foreign powers or due to unauthorized voting, voter disenfranchisement, and technological failures. So basically, they all inevitably call into question the integrity of elections. Now, what is clear in the last 3 decades of very fine research, at least in the area of computer science on designing voting systems, is that it should not be necessary to trust any authorities, individually or collectively, for establishing the correctness of the election process. So any digital voting should essentially be constructed keeping this in mind, that it should be allowed to operate without some explicit trust requirements. Right. So for a digital voting system to be able to operate in such a way, it should satisfy certain minimum requirements before these instruments could be considered for voting, right? So for enabling electoral democracy. So it's because they are sort of in a manner enabling electoral democracy. So what is important is to note is that these set of technical requirements is in fact driven by certain key obligations. And what are those obligations? The first obligation is that the losing candidate has to be provided with a convincing proof of their loss, right? So that's from the candidate who's participating in the election. And from the voter side, the voter, should she demand, be supplied with the guarantee or a proof that her vote was indeed cast as intended, which essentially indicates that the voting machine has registered the vote correctly, and recorded as cast, indicating that the cast vote is correctly included in the final tally. And finally, counted as recorded, which means that the final tally is correctly computed from whatever records were essentially available. And finally, some other key obligations is that no vote should be recorded other than by those who passed through this process of eligibility verification, right? So it should not be the case that I can come into the polling booth and somebody else votes on my behalf. As Shivam was pointing out, that there were cases which cropped up during Indian elections at some parts of India. Right? By the way, I must say that to solve such problems, electronic voting systems will not cut it. Why? Because technological solutionism can only make things messy if not done right. And there are very high chances that technology, if being constructed without putting due thought and due diligence, will inevitably create more problems than solve issues. So the actual solution lies in designing the process rather than focusing too much on technology. And finally, all votes. So the last obligation for designing such voting systems is that all votes must be kept secret during and even after the polling, right? All the way up to tally. So now the first 3 obligations, where votes need to be casted so voter has to be provided these guarantees that the votes were indeed cast as intended, recorded as cast, and counted as recorded. They together form the correctness aspect of a voting system. And this correctness, when you want to take this property and sort of operationalize it, as in if I want to design a system, how should I interpret this correctness property? It invariably ends up splitting down into 2 properties. The first is universal verifiability, which essentially says that through publicly posted data, anybody should be able to verify the correctness of each vote from the tally and from the records that are available. Now, this is, before I go any further, I must also spit out what is the threat model under which I am defining these terms, right? So I have to essentially talk about what are the powers that an adversary can have, which can create ruckus in an election process. So under an adversarial setting, your adversary can do quite a few things. What are those things, right? So it can be a corrupt election authority itself, right? So that's an modeling of an insider attack. Or it can corrupt the polling officers through whatever means. Or it can corrupt the voting machines themselves that are being used to conduct the election. The adversary has the power to alter or delete cast votes during the polling, or during the collection process, or even during the or while publishing the recorded votes into some public bulletin board, right? It can introduce fake votes in the system, which are essentially those votes that are not certified by the polling officer, right? So under such a threat model, assuming these are the powers that an adversary can have, what voting systems must guarantee, what properties voting systems must guarantee, and those two properties are essentially universal verifiability and individual verifiability. So under universal verifiability, like I said, a voting system is universally verifiable if anyone in the public can verify using publicly posted data that each vote is indeed recorded as cast and counted as recorded, right? So the last two properties specified in the first line of the slide. And then there are, of course, no spurious votes in the final tally. Individual verifiability, on the other hand, essentially means that if a voter can obtain a proof that their vote was recorded as intended in the final tally, which means cast as intended as well as recorded as cast. So these two properties together can compose into recorded as intended property, right? So what I'm doing is I'm essentially capturing all those thoughts that were already covered by Shivam in the last talk, but formalizing them if you want to sort of take them up and operationalize in a system. Now, so those were the key obligations for correctness. However, secrecy, vote secrecy is also a key obligation. And under vote secrecy, one must never reveal how a given voter essentially voted to prevent what? To essentially prevent vote selling or coercion. So voting systems where votes are directly recorded, which is such kind of systems are also known as direct recording electronic systems. It is assumed that, for such kind of systems, it is assumed that the machines will not yell out and leak the vote, or they are constructed in a manner that through side channels, they will not leak out information, thereby compromising the vote secrecy. So if I have to consider secrecy and coercion resistance from these properties, keeping these properties as pivots, I would have to then start thinking about what can an adversary do. So I'll have to essentially provide a threat model under which I have to situate these properties. So the threat model for an adversary for secrecy would be that the adversary would be able to observe all voter receipts, or they would be able to observe all voter verified paper trails or paper records, VVPRs, if there is one instituted in the voting process, or the public outputs that the Election Commission decides to put out after the voting process has been conducted. Of course, adversary can participate as a bare-handed voter, can have all the powers that the previous adversary had when we are talking about correctness. And here the adversary can also corrupt the voting machines to reveal votes and other secrets. What the adversary of keeping the secrecy as private cannot do is they cannot corrupt the election authority to reveal the votes or other secrets, right? So under such an environment, system ensures voter secrecy. when given a possibly even malicious voter receipt and publicly posted data, no information can be derived how the voter voted, right? So that is, an individual voter cannot prove to anyone else how she voted. And that is essentially tagged here as individual vote secrecy. Community vote secrecy, on the other hand, is when a bunch of voter receipts, having bunch of voter receipts and publicly posted data, an adversary cannot derive how a community voted, right? So, well, this is community vote secrecy. It is very, very important to preserve this community vote secrecy as well from unintended targeting, right? Or intended targeting for that matter. And finally, so before I go forward to coercion resistance, it is important to state here that individual vote secrecy turns out to be a necessary condition for coercion resistance. Now, and now I come to the point of coercion resistance. It's essentially a property which says an adversary instructing a voter to vote in a certain way cannot determine if the voter did follow the adversary's instructions or not, right? Coercion resistance is very, very important. Otherwise, all fairness and the democratic principles behind behind voting is then lost. Finally, so community vote secrecy is also important to prevent. Why? Because you want to avoid profiling and targeting of voters belonging to a particular locality. Revealing the vote tally of a polling booth mapped to, say, a small neighborhood, compromises community vote secrecy. So essentially, I would come back to a point that Shivam was talking about, that if I were to put out this data of what votes were casted on a particular polling booth, that polling booth essentially captures the voting patterns of a particular neighborhood. It is small, and therefore there is a high chance that community vote secrecy would be compromised. So a suggestion made here is that only an aggregate tally is published to avoid community profiling. You don't publish polling booth level data, but you aggregate the votes across polling booths and then publish them. All right. So so these were the important properties of correctness and secrecy. But in addition, if you want to make sure that not only your voting system has this important property of correctness and secrecy, it also gives you some amount of efficiency, then you will also have to start considering other properties such as recoverability. Now, recoverability has to do with the graceful recovery of a voting system in an event of an attack. How can a voting system recover back? Now, note that an adversary can participate as a voter, as I had mentioned in the previous slide, and the voter, that the adversarial voter, can come back and falsely claim that her vote was not recorded as intended. Right. So, what happens in such a setting? So, so basically, either there is a resolute dispute resolution protocol, which figures out whether the voter is indeed saying true things or making false claims. In addition, what one would want to have in such digital voting systems is that so basically the recoverability property is primarily tied to a software independence property, which demands that a small detected change or error in an election outcome can be corrected without rerunning the election. Now, for so software independence to take place, one needs to have mechanisms in place to identify A, that error has happened in the voting process, and B, to be able to fix the accountability where the error has happened, which polling booth did the error originate from, etc. and etc. So that there can be a graceful recovery. Instead of rerunning the entire election, you could perhaps do a re-election only at a particular polling booth level. So this is the traditional definition of recoverability, which is strong software independence, which essentially demands that a detected change in error in an election outcome can be corrected without rerunning the election. Now, if this software independence recoverability property has to be guaranteed in a voting system, it would inevitably require you to go out of the digital system and maintain some additional record, right? So that's where this idea of VVPR comes in. So public VBR existence is very, very important. Not only that, one should be able to essentially, so pretty much the common understanding is that if you have VVPR facility in your voting system, that is going to be a trusted entity, right? So I will look at, because this is where the intention of the voter is recorded in a manner of speaking. So this is assumed to be correct. Now, the problem is that if I have to show this software independence, I would have to have a one-to-one correspondence of VVPR, voter verified paper record, with a digitally recorded vote, or the electronic vote. So what would this allow? So this would allow one to precisely identify those votes where there is a difference between the VVPR and the electronic vote. So the electronic votes don't match up. So of course one can, so VVPR verifiability is a very important property for recoverability to exist for voting systems. Now, this one-to-one correspondence, the VVPR that I have been speaking about, if it can be publicly demonstrated for any VVPR without compromising individual and community vote secrecy, then we call the voting system to be VVPR verifiable. Now, designing such a voting system is a challenge, and I think there are a lot of voting protocols that are in existence, and whether or not all such voting protocols provide public VVPR verifiability is a matter of question, right? So, and it is also worthwhile to note that there is an inherent tension between this strong software independence and community secrecy, right? So verification, say of a VVPR against a digitally recorded vote may fail in many types of cases. A, where receipts of VVPR exist, but there is no corresponding electronic vote, or there exists electronic vote with no corresponding receipts of VVPRs. If during audit it turns out that the margin of votes between the winner and the next highest vote getter is too narrow, to ignore these verification failures may not be the right thing to do, and it may become imperative to identify the polling booths from where this fault arose, or a set of polling booths from which the fault arose, and conduct polling again in them locally. So however, the problem is, so this process can leak information. So an adversary monitoring the published votes before and after the repolling can really determine which votes have changed, and the adversary can then use this information to correlate the changes with the polling booths involved in the repolling. So such community secrecy compromises, ideally should be limited to recovery procedures and should be minimized to whatever extent possible. So the general wisdom would be to conduct polling at a larger scale, repolling at a larger scale. The larger the size of the repoll, the lesser is the leakage of information. So that's the wisdom. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about dispute resolution a little more. So a voting system should not just be fair, but also appear to be fair. And for that to exist, dispute resolution is one of the key components and it should be there in one of the in voting systems where the intention of the voter is not recorded directly by the voter. If it is said recorded by the machine, then dispute resolution becomes a necessity. All right. So having understood these properties, what I will do now is I will talk about some electronic voting protocols, which are so basically 2 electronic voting protocols, one representative of each type in each category that these voting protocols fall in. So essentially electronic voting protocols are often of 2 types: optical scanning electronic voting protocols, where there are hand-marked paper ballots. So voter comes into the polling booth, looks up at the paper ballot, marks the paper ballot herself, and then gets it scanned. And that's why they are called optical scanning paper ballots. Of course, the system will provide an encrypted part of the vote as a receipt, of the ballot as a receipt. And the encrypted receipts are displayed on essentially public bulletin boards, or the encrypted vote rather is displayed on the public bulletin boards. And there are many such voting protocols over the years that have been designed, which guarantee end-to-end verifiability, right? So many of them provide universal verifiability as well as individual verifiability. The other type of voting protocols are these direct record electronic voting protocols, where the vote is not recorded manually on a paper and then later scanned, but it's directly recorded by the machine. And this is where problems can arise, because how can one then establish that the machine has truly recorded your intent in a correct manner? So there are quite a few DRE protocols as well. I have listed some of them here on this slide. So going forward, there are, of course, some strengths of these voting protocols in the sense that they provide you these correctness properties and end-to-end verifiability, but there are also limitations. So for example, in DREs, there is a dispute resolution problem, and there's no easy fix for this dispute resolution for DREs. Of course, the dispute resolution problems do not arise in optical scanning protocols because the intent of the voter is directly recorded by herself. But DRE or not DRE, there are these randomization attacks which are a problem. So what happens under these randomization attacks? So many voting protocols try to prevent electronic recording machine from learning the vote. And in process of doing so, what they do is they randomize the permutation of candidate order on the prepared ballots, right? So that the voter's selection appears to be random and can only be decrypted at the backend. So every voter will see a different permutation of candidate orderings. Now, these are essentially susceptible to coercion attacks, where a coercer can ask the voter or force the voter to vote for whichever candidate that appears at some fixed point or position in the permutation. So the vote may then get randomized. In a manner of speaking, you can understand this as a denial of voting attack, right? So instead of denial of service, it's a denial of voting attack. Now, the other limitation of these electronic voting protocols is the fact that they rest on very sophisticated and complex cryptography. And so the German Supreme Court in 2019 made an observation where it said that the use of voting machines which electronically record the voters' votes and electronically ascertain the election result only meets the constitutional requirements if the essential steps of the voting and of the ascertainment of the result can be examined reliably and without any specialist knowledge of the subject. Now, these last few words are the words which are very, very important where I want to lay the emphasis, without any specialist knowledge of the subject. And what's happening with most of these electronic voting protocols is that they take the agency away, not just from the voter, but also from the polling officers. So it's some magic that's happening in the voting machines. And I do not have as a voter, I do not have a perfect understanding of what's going underneath. Neither does the polling officer, but we are expected to just trust the workings of this machine to have recorded everything correctly and secretly. So, so many of these protocols do not provide. And of course, the last limitation is that I was talking about this idea of public VVPR verifiability, where this one-to-one correspondence with VVPR slips is important. And it so appears that many of the modern day end-to-end verifiable voting protocols do not provide this correspondence, in the absence of which the trust on the electronic voting system is hard to establish. So I'm left with 10 minutes. I had prepared a couple of slides talking about the process of what happens, say, for an optical scanning voting protocol and a DRE-based voting protocol. So in the interest of time, perhaps I will not go through all the details, but limit my discussion. I'll keep it at a very high-level description of what goes through, right? So as a first step, there is eligibility verification, where a person who is eligible to vote is authenticated at the polling place in accordance to whatever procedures are put in place for voter registration and etc. Now, here I want to come in and comment on what Shivam was talking about. Electronic voting machines, of course, theoretically are hackable, but much of the fraud actually takes place in the electoral roll lists, right, at the eligibility verification phase. So it's very easy to delete a voter from an electoral record. Maintaining the integrity of electoral record is of paramount importance, and we'll see that perhaps this is perhaps one area where a very specific variant of blockchains could be applicable without the network, right? Just a cryptographic, untamperable bulletin boards, append-only bulletin boards can implement electoral records. That is essentially a part of blockchain, because blockchain is this plus a distributed consensus. So, so Shivam is absolutely right. I mean, voting on blockchain or blockchain for voting doesn't make a whole lot of sense now, or in posterity, but there's a lot of hype around it. Okay, so the second so before the voting happens, let me very briefly talk about how the ballot is prepared. So at least in this optical scanning protocol that I'm discussing, which is Scantigrity 2, the ballot consists of a voting portion, right? So this is the voting portion, a receipt portion, which is shown below after this perforated lining, dotted line, with a unique, and every ballot has been provided a unique ballot ID number, right? So the ballot ID number is there in the voting portion as well as in the receipt portion. And the voting portion of the ballot includes a list of candidate names with an optical mark, right? Because this is hand mark based protocols. So there are these optical marks, and all the voter has to do is use their pen to mark on. So initially, all of these optical marks would not show these very unique IDs that are behind them, right? So the ballot includes basically these list of candidate names, but each bubble contains a sequence of randomly generated alphanumeric characters, so to speak, which are essentially also called in literature as confirmation codes. And these are printed via an invisible ink. So before the ballot is marked, none of the confirmation codes are essentially visible. And if a voter has to indicate her preference, all she has to do is just use her decoder pen to just mark over these bubbles, and that particular alphanumeric encoding would present itself. Right. So once it is done, so the receipt portion is optional. If the voter chooses, she can record this alphanumeric text in the receipt portion, and because it's perforated, she can tear it off and keep it with herself. Actually, she has to show it to the polling officer, and the polling officer will stamp it by saying that, okay, so the voting has been recorded, right? Or at least cast. Now, so that's essentially the receipt stamping and the collection. And then what the voter does is she, in the presence of a polling officer, scans the top part or the voting part or the vote of the receipt of this ballot, and it shows up on the screen. So she can cross-check whether the ordering is correct. In fact, what is important to note here is the actual vote would not be available to the machine. So the machine will not get to know that the voter has actually voted for Aarti. All that they would be able to scan is that alphanumeric encoding. So now the voter can go ahead and cast her ballot, and then basically take this receipt home. And then there is this entire process of posting these votes and tallying these votes, which is a very interested, sophisticated cryptographically based system where the Election Commission is maintaining a bunch of tables, some private, some public, and these tables are connected to each other via mappings, which are essentially cryptographically protected, and these mappings can essentially be proved that nobody has essentially gone and changed data across these tables, right? So the cryptographic primitive that is typically used to prove whether at the time of tallying that these mappings are indeed correct from the vote to whatever encrypted data that has been put out in the public domain, there is this cryptographic primitive called mixnets. So this is the case in optical scanning scantigrity protocol. Of course, one could change this cryptographic primitive. The other kind of protocols use something called as homomorphic encryption, where tallying is done using this homomorphic property, where votes being added, and the encryption of votes being added is essentially equal to the encrypted vote being multiplied together, right? So this is the additive homomorphism, so some of the voting protocols, their backends essentially use this homomorphic property. I think there are a lot of technical details. I would not want to get into it. Otherwise, this will just confuse a lot of audience. And so in the interest of time also, let me move ahead. So the optical scanning voting protocols, the VVPR verifiability is essentially non-public. It can be done. So the public VVPR verifiability does indeed exist, but it is non-public in the sense that they would have to open up the entire mixnet in order to make these mappings between the electronic vote and the VVPR. And in process of doing so, the vote secrecy would be breached. So it cannot be a public process. The other thing is, for DRE voting protocols, is the fact that VVPR verifiability is only partially available because, again, that would mean, so that the technical detail behind it is that the homomorphism has to be, again, they will have to open up everything, and which is counterproductive because it defeats the purpose of having this homomorphic encryption in place in the first place. More importantly, DRE voting protocols such as Star Vote provide no secrecy from DRE scanners, right? So somebody who's scanning the vote, or printers, or right. So so that's that. And like I said, what happens in the back end is, so once the tallying has happened, the Election Commission has to provide a proof that the tallying has been done correctly. And again, a very sophisticated computer science technique is used here to show that correct tallying has happened. What the authorities do is they decrypt the encrypted tally of votes and publish a proof, which is a very interesting proof. It is called a zero knowledge proof of the correct decryption. So essentially the proof is saying that I have not done any hanky-panky during the decryption process. So the tally is indeed correct, according to whatever recorded data I have. Let me skip this introduction to these crypto primitives of what is zero knowledge proofs and others. So zero knowledge proof, let me make one statement on it. It's a proof strategy where if there is a declarative statement that requires a proof, one is able to obtain a proof for that without knowing the knowledge required to design that proof. So no knowledge behind the proof is essentially leaked, but the verifier is convinced in a certain way that the declarative statement is indeed correct. The assertion made in a particular declarative statement is true. So what I'll do is I will take last 2-3 minutes to touch upon internet voting and block-based voting, and primarily upon their unsuitability. So internet voting, in my opinion and in many others' opinion, of course, in fact, a lot of very big computer scientists, in a sense, that who have been working in this space for decades altogether, have clearly talked about the unsuitability of internet voting. Why so? Because how do we guarantee coercion freedom? If you have an app or a mobile phone and from your bedroom you are allowed to vote, then coercion freedom goes for a toss. There is no way where you can guarantee coercion freedom. So it's just not possible. So there's an impossibility result right there. The other question is, how can we trust the device and the app themselves? And then in a day and age where malwares can seep through a different app that you downloaded, not the voting app, but through a different app, and that malware can wreak havoc, right? So not only can it break your voting secrecy, but voter secrecy, but it can do all sorts of unimaginable stuff, breaking all the correctness properties. And how do we really establish that your device and app is indeed correct? So that itself is a computationally infeasible exercise, as has been established in literature, right? Again, how do we guarantee software independence in the presence of such device and apps? So software independence goes for a toss. And therefore, if you don't have strong software independence, you don't have recoverability, and so on and so forth. So, and again, then auditability and other properties also come under question. So a very serious computer scientist who has done a lot of work in this space, Ronald Rivest, in fact, he is also a winner of Turing Award, Nobel Prize equivalent. He was the guy who gave an RSA, an encryption strategy. He says that internet and blockchain-based voting would greatly increase the risk of undetectable and national scale election failures. And he substantiates it with a lot of information. So to say that to have internet voting just for ease and convenience and to increase the voter turnout, apparently that also turns out to be incorrect. There have been various studies done in Switzerland and Belgium where they have shown either no impact on voter turnout or rather negative impact on voter turnout. And there have been other studies done in Canada which show that, in fact, so this study was not in Canada. I think there's a typo here. It was done in Estonia, where they said that, well, with internet voting, what they saw was that it would favor groups with higher income or higher education, right? So demographics which who have higher income or higher education. And that is understandable, right? So how would a person who is not lettered would navigate such technology? So usability also is under. So all of these properties that people typically point to while promoting internet voting or blockchain-based voting, people have done studies and they don't inspire confidence. Again, unsuitability of blockchain-based voting. So, this is again a non-starter, because blockchains are essentially built on top of these nuts and bolts called smart contracts. Who's going to establish the correctness of these smart contracts? Your smart contracts are wrong, your entire blockchain is cannot be trusted. So its USP falls flat on its face. Well, it's a network, and then therefore it will open itself up to a much larger set of attacks, like denial of service attacks, right? Or collusions and cartelization. A group of users operating through their pseudonymous identities get together, collude, create cartels, and create a fork in the network. And then what they do is they show one tally to one set of people and other, so one kind of information to one group of people and one other kind of information to other group of people, right? So this is opening a whole can of worms at a point in time when we are still, working on unconnected sequential voting machines, digital voting machines, right? Again, so if you were to consider permissionless blockchain voting systems, then clearly the visibility of votes is under no question. The votes have to be visible to all the players, all the participants in the blockchain. And then how do you talk about preventing coercion and vote selling when the vote information is freely available for everyone? So a limited setting where a component of blockchain technology that could be used, which I had referred to earlier in my talk, is in implementing electoral rolls. And what is that component of blockchain? Essentially, this idea of cryptographically chaining the records of a blockchain. Through this cryptographic chaining, one could obtain properties of untamperability, append-only untamperability to these records. And this is what we want in electoral rolls. So once you have been added as a registered voter for a particular constituency, nobody should be able to manipulate those details, right? So these are the properties that would be guaranteed through certified, through cryptographic hashing or hash chaining of these records. It gives you these properties of certified publishing and an auditable history. So that's a very limited component where a component of blockchain perhaps could be used. I think with that, I will end my talk. Thanks for your attention. The early version of our article, from which many of the ideas that I discussed in the slides is available here. Thank you, and I'm open to taking questions now.
Thank you very much, Professor. Very interesting, very interesting presentation from you, and very informative. And you provided an excellent framework for judging suitability of different types of voting systems, and you discussed some of them also. I wish I could say for myself that I understood everything, and now it's clear what is possible and what's not possible. but clearly it's difficult to compress so much into one session from both sides, for the presenter, because you know so much, and also for the audience to grasp all of it. I have a question, and there are a couple of questions from the audience, so we can quickly take them up. The one question that came to my mind was that I need to be able to verify that my vote was correctly recorded and counted, right?
Yeah.
But if I can verify that my vote was correctly recorded and counted, it opens me out to the risk of somebody asking me to do that verification in the presence of a witness. So these two things will always be in conflict. Would they not be?
Right. So essentially your vote is never revealed.
No, vote will get revealed if I can verify that my vote was correctly counted. So
Yeah,
so somebody can stand on my head and say, okay, reveal to me that it has been correctly counted, and which means reveal to me that it has gone to the candidate that I wanted to vote for.
correct. But this would be something that is a mapping which you only know of, and which is not given as a piece of as an information in the receipt that you got, the encrypted receipt.
That's okay. That's
right?
okay. That's okay. But
So
if I can verify,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
If I can verify it, right, after the votes have been recorded, if I can access that and see that yes, it is correctly recorded, then somebody can watch over me to see that yes, what am I seeing? You know, it's not only an assurance to me; it's a verifiability that I can execute later after casting the vote, and that opens me up to some kind of threat.
But it's not a piece of information that you can provide to anybody. You always have this freedom of lying.
If I may come in, you can give this proof in zero knowledge. So there are cryptographic techniques where you can give the proof in zero knowledge without revealing, and all such proofs will have to be zero knowledge proofs. And there are easy techniques over last 30 years.
That's true. That's true that zero knowledge proofs can be constructed, but this would make the German courts.
Absolutely.
You know, it will make it very difficult for people to deal with zero knowledge proofs, unless it was their apps which were doing it, in which case the trust shifts to the app or to some other system, you know, and it creates its own problems. So thanks a lot. And there are a couple of questions also from Mr. Balun Mitra. He says, won't targeting of voters when the community level voting data is widely and publicly available be more easy to detect, and therefore it may prevent or help prosecute such assaults, as well as build social pressure against targeting?
Won't targeting of the voters when the community level voting data is widely and publicly available be more easy to detect? And therefore it may prevent or help prosecute such assaults, as well as build social pressures against targeting. So, of course, I mean, how do you establish a correspondence or rather some sort of a correlation between targeting of voters and this community profiling? So that's where the problem lies, right? I mean, of course, the targeting is indeed happening, but in ways where you cannot say that this targeting is happening because that targeting, the people behind that targeting have this sort of an information. So if a party A, if a particular party A knows that in a particular community they don't get a vote, they are anyways doing it. They will preserve their resources and not do a whole lot of campaigning there. Where they know that there are fence sitters, perhaps they will put in a lot more resources and try to swing the vote there. So it's already happening. But how do you establish that?
Correct. And we can't also be sure that publicly, if something is available, something is known, that pressure can be built enough to prevent it from happening. That's also not necessarily, that's debatable as well. He has another question. US used some kind of optical scanning for ballots, thus keeping two parallel tracks of votes, the digital and the paper. Did this make the system verifiable?
So basically, what happens is the paper copy of the ballot is typically shredded, and put into dustbin. Otherwise, some correlations can be made and voter secrecy can be compromised. So there are some districts and constituencies where optical scanning based ballots are indeed used. But I'm not sure whether they really do maintain the paper copy of the ballot. So once it's been scanned, they maintain the digital copy. Perhaps they can keep the paper copy for VVPR, public VVPR verifiability.
No, that's not correct. In United States, you are not allowed to do electronic elections only.
Right. US as a nation doesn't do it, but there are constituencies, for example.
No, even no constituency is allowed to do it. So you always do only paper elections. The problem is that verifiability does not come because the VVPR and the electronic elections are run as two independent parallel elections. They're not coupled together. So that's why the verifiability does not come in the systems.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much.
One-to-one correspondence between them is the
that's not
missing piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Subodh Sharma, for this very interesting talk, and for helping clarify all these issues which just the previous speaker had thrown up so graphically. So thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are supposed to have a 10-minute break, but we are already 10 minutes late. So I think we just go right ahead, and any breaks that are required, we people can individually take them. So since it's already past the 4:40 time slot for Professor Subhashis Banerjee, we'll go straight through, skipping the break. And Professor Banerjee is well known to us, at least the people who have been watching this One Vote series. He's a professor at the Department of Computer Sciences at Ashoka University. He's been deeply involved in writing, educating, and commenting on the intersection of technology, society, and politics. His recent work includes commenting on a range of topics such as Aadhaar, contact tracing applications, as well as electronic voting. I had heard him speak last time. He described all the election technology and various the systems of elections and the concerns, and it was mind-opening, and where he also traced the conclusions to the original papers that illustrious people like Ronald Rivest have written. So I look forward to this talk from you, Professor Banerjee. He's going to speak on Citizens Commission on elections, a report and an analysis of voting systems in India. So over to you, Professor Banerjee.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. Let me just share my slides. Are the slides visible?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. Yes, so I will. I'll talk about. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the opportunity to give this talk and the introduction. So I will talk about the Citizens Commission of Election, which brought out its report earlier part of this year in 2021. And it brought out several reports, but I'll restrict in this talk only to electronic voting. So the Citizen Commissions of Election was formed just before the pandemic started, around January, February of 2020. And the key person, as whose behest the Citizens Commission was formed, was Mr. M.G. Devasaham. And I can see that he's listening in. Thank you, sir. I think that the commission did work for about over 1.5 years with over more than 100 Zoom calls, went through volumes of depositions, did lots of research, and were helped by a whole lot of other people. It was headed by Justice Madan Lakur. It also had the advantage of having two constitutional judges in the commission who kept us in check. And the volume 1 dealt with the compliance in EVM and VVPAT with democracy principles. The reason this was brought out was the unrest in the country with the speculations about possibilities of hacking and so on and so forth. The second part, which dealt with many more topics, it dealt with electoral rolls. That study was done by Mr. V. Ramani and Harsh Mandar with a little addendum by me. Money, power, and criminalization was mostly researched by Anjali Bharadwaj. Model code of conduct by Jagdeep Shokar and others. Role of media by Paranjay Ghotakurta. Role of VCI by Professor Sanjay Kumar. It also dealt with many other topics like linking Aadhaar with the voters list, disenfranchisement, and so on and so forth. The 2 volumes is going to come out as a book, edited by Mr. Devasaham and published by Paranjay Ghotakurta in the early part of the next year. So I'll essentially talk about volume 1 of this report. So the volume 1 was essentially based on depositions and depositions by these ladies and gentlemen. I think that the last series of depositions in which Ronald Rivest, whose name was mentioned several times, and Philip Starr.
So, Brian, I think if you have changed the slides, I don't see that on the screen.
Okay, I know what has happened. So let me just unshare.
Now I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, let me just unshare and reshare. I should share the screen. Otherwise, this turns out to be a little problematic. Just give me a moment. Let me stop share. Sorry about that. I don't share the desktop, but share the entire screen. How do I do that? Okay. So can you share the screen now? So what can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen. But if you change the slides, then that will confirm whether the slides change.
Okay. Now I'm moving back and forth.
Yeah, I saw that. Okay.
Good. Yeah. So this was based on depositions by these ladies and gentlemen. Very large number of high quality depositions, and the computer science lot by Purvi Vora. I mean, this was a joint deposition. Purvi collected all of them from people who have worked in elections for now 30 years, like Ronald Rivest and Philip Starr. And they were surprisingly aware of the Indian elections, and all of them deposed, and they were very, very valuable. And let me try to, give out our findings. So first is why electronic voting, and I think Shivam brought out this topic. In computer science, as Subodh mentioned, computer science has looked at electronic elections for 40 years, and there are great protocols over many, many years. Traditionally, in computer science, it's only because of correctness. It's never because of efficiency. In fact, electronic elections are not that efficient. But somehow in the Indian discourse, these two have got a little confused. Right? So sometimes we talk about efficiency, sometimes we talk about correctness, and sometimes we mistake that. So the democracy principles, I mean, this is essentially a simplification of the Representation of the People's Act. If you read the Representation of the People's Act and the main wish list out of the Representation of the People's Act, if you summarize in plain English and cut out the legalese, then this is what it will look like, right? So it should be transparent. The general public should be satisfied about that the voter recorded correctly. The voting process ought to be publicly auditable. Ordinary citizens should be able to check the essential steps, right? That's a crucial thing. So no zero knowledge proofs, as was already mentioned out here. The election process should not only be free and fair, but should also be seen to be free and fair. It should create public trust, and otherwise the whole purpose of electoral democracy gets defeated. The election commission should be in full control of the entire voting process. It should not be that they have, the certain parts of the election is being conducted by methods and means which they are not aware of or not directly in control with. And electronic processes, that if they're to be used for voting at all, this was not a part of the Representation of the People's Act, but this is a conventional wisdom all around the world. They should be in sync with changing technologies and practices and be amenable to public audit and scrutiny. Right? So that's a desiderata. And when you come to electronic verifiability, the public verifiability essentially comes from two parts. Right? There's an administrative verifiability. And administrative verifiability essentially is what ECI has largely put his efforts on, which is certification of equipment. There's an elaborate process by which equipment is certified. There's a trustworthiness of custody chain of election, pre and post election. There are strong rooms, there are seals of various kind, there are locking of EVMs, putting them in trunks, moving them around by tracking with GPS. There's a variety of methods. They are well listed in the ECI webpage, which they do. The trustworthiness of the custody chain of VVPAT slips. So this is essentially based on seals and strong room. So there's an assumption that the VVPATs, even if they're trustworthy right at the election, they remain trustworthy at the time of counting, which is some are not destroyed or new ones are not added. And these are standard conventional administrative processes that take care of it. And VVPATs are supposed to audit electronic elections. So this is a simple scheme that we practice in India. The public verifiability part is largely missing, right? I mean, which is Subodh talked about at great length that what computer science has endeavors to give methods so that the public can directly verify that their votes are cast as intended, recorded as cast, and counted as recorded. So this part is largely missing and omitted in Indian elections. So what we found is that since these crucial steps are missing, so we've got computer science into public life, but left its rigor behind. And that has created a little bit of a problem. There is a general public mistrust about the whole process. And I think Shivam mentioned that he hasn't seen whether there's any direct evidence of tampering. No, even the commission did not get any direct evidence of tampering. But the commission did get lots of report about indirect evidence of tampering. The commission received depositions, which means 2 lakh EVMs went missing. PCI had no control of them. Or EVMs landed up in the car dicky of the car of a candidate, so which means that many of the administrative verifiability processes have been violated. Now, whether that has influenced the election, it's not clear, right? Some political parties say yes, some political parties say no, but this mistrust is not good for democracy. What are the easy ways to remove this mistrust? That's what we will try to explore a little bit. There is this recent talk about internet voting, quite a bit, right? And this is almost impossible, as Subodh mentioned. I just quietly believed in computer science. Computer science has known this for a very, very long time, that internet voting are a strict no-no. And I think there is a complete agreement with it. So in the computer science community. So that this is being talked about in the national scale in India is a little surprising. And this, as Subodh has already mentioned, but let me touch upon, this is because of two essential problems. What is the secure platform problem? So you may own a cell phone or an app, but for a general voter, or for even the expert voter, like a computer scientist like Subodh, there is no way for him to know that his machine is not hacked or tampered, right? So that his machine or his cell phone will follow his instruction correctly and vote as he wanted, there is no way to guarantee that. Right? That's called the secure platform problem. Now, right now, computer science cannot solve that problem. There's no way to give a guarantee that your cell phone will not get hacked. One cell phone maybe yes, but a public collection of cell phones will not get hacked. There's no such technique in computer science. Whether such techniques will evolve in the next 20, 30 years, we hope it will, but we are unsure. But the second problem will never get solved, how to make it coercion free. Right? As long as the possibility, I think Subodh tried to mention this, that as long as the possibility of the wife coercing the husband to vote for her favorite political party, internet voting is not possible, right? So if they don't come to the polling booth and vote from their bedroom, there's no way of knowing who is coercing who. And that problem, no technology or social process can even solve. Right? So that makes internet voting a strict no-no. It's an impossibility. And this has been realized for a very, very long time. It's not new. For 15 years, this has been documented that internet voting is an impossibility. And the US National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine jointly in 2018 recommended that elections can be only conducted using polling booths, and that too using human readable paper ballots, not using complicated electronic or cryptographic technology. And this is a 200-member committee that made this recommendation very recently in 2018. And they were quite emphatic. The report is available online, and it's quite an emphatic report out there. And this roughly followed the recommendation of the German Constitutional Court, which came out in 2009 with a recommendation which almost banned electronic voting in Germany. So though this is not, the German Constitutional Court's ruling is not applicable in other jurisdictions like United States, England, Ireland, France, and so on and so forth. But most countries have honored this judgment, and I'll explain why. So most countries have abided by this judgment and have moved away from electronic voting completely. So let's now look at only an EVM only solution. Let's try to see that why the German Constitutional Court gave this ruling. And let's talk about an EVM only solution where you, assume for the time being, there is no VVPR or no VVPAT associated with the process. So votes are recorded electronic by press of a button, and it gets recorded somewhere inside electronically. And there's no way for the voter to know what has been recorded. So I pressed 1 and the machine recorded 2. And it tells me that I've recorded 1. There's no way for a voter to verify what has got recorded. Right? And this violates almost all principles of voting. So there is no way for a voter to provide a guarantee to a voter that the vote is cast as intended. There's no way to resolve a dispute either, right? If the voter says that, look, my vote was not recorded correctly, there is no way the election authority can convince the voter that is not the case, because it has just gone inside and incremented some counter by 1, and you only have an aggregate vote. So you have lost all ways to resolve a dispute. And as Subodh mentioned, not having dispute resolution is not good for voter confidence. So that's a typical problem. And also, there is no way to establish that a system as complicated as an EVM is correct. It is known to be theoretically a very hard problem, almost an impossible problem. And this was proved mathematically by Rebecca Mercury in 1992, that the correctness is impossible to prove. Note, I must also add that the incorrectness is also impossible to prove. Right? That the machine is incorrect is also impossible to prove. So in general, to make a statement that this machine will always function correctly, statements of the type that ECI is routinely making every day in national press, there is a theorem to say that such statements have no meaning, right? And the theorem is due to Mercury. So she's the one who recommended VVPATs in 1992. So she said that one easy way to solve this problem, if done correctly, is to have a voter verified paper audit trail, and which has become routine in most elections all over the world. And it is, in general, hence it is impossible to predict whether a machine like this can ever reach a state that will violate democracy principles. Right? So the machine can potentially, as complicated as an EVM, can potentially lie in a very, very large number of states, and it's impossible to examine all of them to figure out that whether one of them is a hacked state or not. Right? So that's not possible. So it is impossible to say whether an EVM can be hacked or not. That an EVM has not been hacked is no guarantee that it cannot be. If it is hacked, it is hacked. But till it is hacked, nobody can make any statement about the hackability of it. Testing of a system such as an EVM can never constitute a proof. You can only test a finite kind of behaviors. You can test for functioning, but you can never test for correctness. You can say that the most common use cases, the machine is behaving correctly. But you can never test for the infinitely many uncommon use cases that can throw up. So in computer science, we have got a maxim that testing never constitutes a proof. So you can never certify a machine to be correct by testing. That's not possible. And theoretically, one can never test for all possibilities. So in particular, a hacked system can easily be made to behave correctly under test conditions. That's not a problem at all. And I think that many people in the depositions have pointed this out. At least 6 or 7 depositions have pointed this out. So these issues like these claims that one-time programmability, quality assurance testing, we have done all this and hence we are correct, they don't pass muster. They are statements of dubious quality. And none of casters intended, recorded as cast and counted as recorded are possible. And it is the onus should be on the ECI to demonstrate correctness, not on others to show that it can be hacked. So this public challenge like come and hack, they are, the little bit of a circus. They don't make any sense really. And I think that the Citizens Commission's report has come down very strongly on such practices. Elections Committee's job is not to throw hackathon, but to convince the public at large that the system and the process that they have designed with or without electronics is correct. So the ruling of the German Constitutional Court says this. I think the main point is that because an EVM is a black box and there's no way to know what is going on inside. So the use of voting machines which electronically record a voter's vote and ascertain the election results meet constitutional guarantees only if the essential steps of voting and the ascertainment of result can be examined reliably without any specialist knowledge of the subject. So German Constitutional Court is quite clear that computer scientists like Subodh and or the Election Commission's technical expert committee have no locus standi. They should not be trusted. They are untrustworthy. And just on their certification, an election cannot be declared correct. Nobody in a public election has a right to claim expertise to declare an election correct. So this has to be verifiably correct and without any specialist knowledge. So an expert has no role in the conduct of an election. And this was a very, very compelling judgment. And most of the world has abided by it, but not so in India. And that's a concern a little bit. The Constitutional Court also said that the legislature is not prevented from using electronic voting machine if the possibility of reliable examination of correctness, which is constitutionally prescribed, is safeguarded. So it suggested that you may use a complementary examination system, perhaps through a VVPAT, where votes are recorded in another way beyond electronic, beside electronic storage. In India, Mr. Subramaniam Swamy bought this filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court and relying mostly on this German Constitutional Court's judgment. And he got a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court, as a result of which Election Commissioner of India was asked to introduce VVPAT and not use EVM-only solutions. So since 2011, 2012, thereabouts, we are using VVPATs in our elections, and mostly because of this ruling by the German Constitutional Court. So we need VVPATs, right? And this was recommended by Mercury way back in 1992. She almost thought in her PhD thesis that without VVPAT, there is no real way to do an election. Must say that she had foresight. So what is the conventional wisdom? The conventional wisdom is that there is a definite need to move away from certifying voting equipment, from a certification process, to establishing that the outcome is correct. Even if you're using wrong machines, even if you're using uncertified machines, it does not matter as long as you can show that there is no, that your outcome has no problem. And this is the way to conduct trustworthy elections. And I think the German Supreme Court made this observation. The US National Science Academies made this observation. And Rebecca Mercury made this observation way back in 1992, that you can never conduct an election correctly by certifying voting equipment. Right? That's a strict no-no. Instead, concentrate on establishing that your election are correct independent of the voting equipment. Right? There are two ways to do this. The first way has been examined in computer science for now 40 years, which is end-to-end verifiable, cryptographically secure voting protocol. Right? These are, many of them are extremely sound. Some Subodh has presented. We believe we have one from IIT-Delhi, which is completely correct, takes care of everything. But they are difficult to deploy in public life because of they're good to publish papers with, get academic brownie points. But deploying them in public and throwing them at the public at large is a little bit of a problematic issue. Because of the ruling of the German Constitutional Court, it will require experts to certify correctness, mathematicians to certify correctness. And why an electorate should trust mathematics is not clear. In fact, clear that they should not trust mathematics. So worldwide cryptographic voting systems are not popular. It's not because they're incorrect, but it is because that generating trust in them requires certification by experts. But ECI should still obviously explore the possibilities. I believe that if not today, tomorrow, this is the route to doing elections correctly, because you can give mathematical guarantees that elections can be conducted correctly, completely correctly, without any risk whatsoever. The second way to do this, if the first is not a possibility, and it appears to be not a possibility today, is to do post-election risk limiting audits using VVPATs. That you have got a VVPAT system, that you have recorded votes using VVPATs. Use those VVPATs to do a risk limiting audit. How to do this is completely worked out in this great paper called Evidence-Based Election by Stark and Wigner. Stark submitted a deposition to the Citizens Commission of Election as well. He's a professor of statistics at Berkeley. And he gave this elaborate statistical procedure about how to do the audit. And we will discuss some of that. So what are the essential requirements? And essential requirements are then software independence. The Subodh touched upon, and this essentially means that if there is an undetected change in software or hardware, that should not cause an undetectable change in the election outcome. So even if the machine malfunctions, it should be possible to detect that the malfunctioning has happened. That's called software independence. This does not mean that you cannot use software or hardware, but a malfunction in the software should not become undetectable. Right? So that's what we call software independence in computer science. And the second property is dispute resolution. That is clear that anybody challenges, like Subodh challenges that my vote was not recorded correctly, that must result in either the challenger or the election authority being proved wrong. So there has to be a clear determination about it one way or the other. Right? If there is no dispute resolution, there is no voter confidence in the process. No, dispute resolution cannot be done in a direct electronic recording machine. Between a man in a secret transaction between a man and a machine, there is no way of determining who is lying. If I press 1 and the machine said you press 2, that's an event that has happened without any witness, and it's obvious common sense that there's no way to conclusively determine who is right, who is wrong. Between two human beings in private also there is no way, but there are traditional methods like fist fights and so on and so forth, but you can't even fight with a machine. So the only solution is then be fair to the voter. you cannot possibly be fair to a machine. That doesn't make sense. So if you cannot do dispute resolution in an electronic machine, then as many of our people who have deposed to the commission have said, that the only sensible solution is to be fair to the voter. So what are the VVPAT requirements? This is required by law in most jurisdictions, including in India. That if you conduct electronic elections, then VVPAT are a must. But the Indian VVPAT system, in our examination, we found that has some lacunae. There is no clear definition in about which is the vote. Right. So the representation of the People's Act talked about the ballot paper as well. The EVM somehow has not even made a proper appearance in the representation of the People's Act. So there's a big problem. And now if you're running two parallel elections, one with voter verified paper audit trail, and one is the electronic vote, then which is the vote? Because they're not in one-to-one correspondence, so they're not demonstratively in one-to-one correspondence. In which case, which is the one that should be counted? That's a lacuna that is there in the Indian election system. Indian election system, the representation of the people act says that the paper one should be the vote, but India seems to be counting the electronic one, right? And that is both a theoretical, political, constitutional anomaly. Second is the voter should have a full agency to cancel a vote, cast vote if not satisfied, right? And this process should be simple and should not require the voter to interact with anybody. But the Indian VVPAT system is not truly voter verified. It's not truly voter verified because of the following reason, that if you press a button, so suppose you vote for a political party A, and suppose the VVPAT slip prints political party B, there's no way for the voter to cancel the vote. Because the voter verified paper audit slip does not come to the voter's hand. And there is no physical process of casting the vote. So it gets displayed behind a glass window for 7 seconds and then gets detached and falls in a sack and becomes indistinguishable. So if that point the voter raises a dispute that, look, I pressed my preference for political party A and the VVPAT slip printed political party B, then there is no way to resolve that dispute. And there is Indian election system, there is an incredible report of such disputes, and there is also a 5,000 rupees fine if the voter cannot prove that she is being truthful. Now that is a travesty of justice, right? And as a result, in our depositions, we heard a story that even a retired police officer, claims that he's scared to dispute. That how will I ever prove that that I'm right? Now look, that if the polling officer comes in and does a mock poll next time, that the mock poll happened correct, does not mean that the previous complaint was incorrect, right? That's incorrect logic. So so the voter verified paper audit trail is not truly voter verified. So this needs to be corrected. And the only way this needs to be can be corrected is the voter verified paper audit trail is something that comes to the voter's hand. The voter checks it, and to complete the voting process, manually puts it in the box. Right? That's the notion of a casting. In which case, the paper should be the true vote, the correct vote. The electronic one is only a proxy, and this needs to be correctly reflected and in an amendment in the Representation of People's Act. And this is a recommendation. This is one of the recommendations of the Commission, that this is too much of a undefined status, which does not make sense. This needs to be immediately corrected in future elections. Now the VVPAT requirements of the VVPAT may be trustworthy during voting. Suppose it comes to the voter's hand and the voter puts it in a box, then it's definitely trustworthy during the voting. It captures the voter's instinct. But how do you know that they remain trustworthy during audit? There's an intervening period in the last parliamentary constitutional election. There were 3 months or 2 months gap between voting and counting. And this requires compliance audits. And, so Stark and Wagner details an elaborate process by which this compliance audit can happen to ensure that there are trustworthiness. There are statistical processes, which I will not describe out here. The next question about which there are about, I believe there are some 20 or 30 cases pending right now in Supreme Court of India, which is how many EVMs should be audited. An EVM captures about 2,000 votes. A polling booth is about of 2,000 votes. Assembly constituency typically has about 300 EVMs. A parliamentary constituency about 10,000 EVMs. So how many of those EVMs should be audited with full manual paper counting? And this is a dispute. And suppose what should be done if an EVM count does not match the VVPAT count? Declare the election for the entire population null and void and do a re-election, or discard the electronic votes and do a paper count for the entire constituency. Now, these are not adequately defined in the Election Commissions of India's procedure, and this is a big problem. They say audit, fine, we audit, but if the audit fails, so if you find that by electronic count party A has won, but by manual VVPAT count party B has won in a polling booth, right? Then what can you conclude about the entire constituency? And what should you do? Now, you know that the electronic count is not matching the paper count. Now, which should you trust? Paper, electronics? Right now, the answer is electronics, and this is a hugely problematic. Situation because of reasons that I'll try to. But anyway, this first is that this process is not defined completely. So this requires making amendments in the Representation of People's Act and making this completely clear what should be done in case of a mismatch. Okay, so the risk limiting audit process goes. The other thing I want to mention out here is that we requested the ex-election commissioners to depose. The last 10 chief election commissioners to depose to a committee. Only one of them did, Mr. Qureshi. We also asked the technical committee of the Election Commission of India to depose before the commission. We got no reply. But from private conversations, we heard that the reason that the VVPAT slips cannot be counted is that it takes too much time. Right. And almost all the people that we talked to, like Shivam Shankar Singh, who made a presentation, thought that time should not be an issue. You're electing your representative, your prime minister, will rule you for the next 5 years. And how does 2 more days matter to count all VVPAT slips? Right. And also, there are technologies to count VVPAT slips. There are note counting machines in the banks. IIT-Delhi can design a mechanical VVPAT slip counting machine, which can just count 2,000 VVPAT slips in a matter of 1 second. It'll go and count. So, if note counting machines can be designed, why can't VVPAT counting machines not be designed? And if you count by a mechanical process, standalone process, and if that tallies with the electronic process, things are all right. So not counting the VVPAT slips, there is the commission found no convincing reason that why the entire set of VVPAT slips should not be counted. It appeared to the commission that's an easy thing to do. It should not even take too much time, even if done manually, and there is no need to do it manually. There are note counting machines that you can go to every bank. Such a thing can be designed, and there are many companies and educational institutions and IITs in India that can effortlessly design such a counting machine, so mechanical counting machine. So again, the response that this will make it inefficient does not pass muster. But if you want to do a statistical sampling only and not count the entire EVM, I think that you should count all the VVPATs, but if you don't want to count all VVPATs, then this question assumes that how many EVMs should be audited by full VVPAT counting? And the answer in statistics comes from this distribution called a hypergeometric distribution. So you don't have to understand it, but this essentially defines the probability of finding K defective item in NRAW in a population of capital N, which may have capital K defective objects. So if you know that there are 1% faulty television sets, right? 1% television sets are faulty. Then how many should you sample in a population of 1,000? How many television sets should you examine closely to determine, say, 5 faulty sets? Right? This is given by the hypergeometric distribution. This is routine in engineering. This is taught to second-year students in statistics. And every component, engineering component, is audited. You cannot probably test every possible car that you are manufacturing. You select a small sample based on a statistical sample given by the hypergeometric distribution, put them to rigorous test. And if they pass the test, you declare that the whole lot is correct statistically with a very high probability. Right? This is the way you sell televisions. This is the way you sell cars. This is the way you sell cell phones and computers. No company has the wherewithal to test every iPhone that they have manufactured. That's not possible. It comes out of the factory with a standard process. You check a small statistical sample and declare the whole lot correct with a high confidence. Now, if you do that process, this is from an IAS officer called Ashok Varadan Shetty. He didn't depose to our commission, but he wrote an article in the Hindu Business Line before the commission came out, and the commission took suo motu cognizance of his article. And his statistics were impeccable, and it matched Professor Philip Stark's recommendation exactly. Right? They gave exactly the same process. And what it says is that suppose 1% EVMs are faulty or hacked or whatever, right? To detect at least one faulty EVM with 99% probability, how many EVMs should you sample? Now, it so turns out that if your population is what is this? How many zeros? This is 1 crore. Of course, there's 7 zeros. I can't even read. So if you take, but it does not matter. If it is 1 crore, and if it is 1% faulty EVM, sampling 459 EVMs, you will get one faulty EVM with 99% certainty, right? And if you add one more zero, the number doesn't change. It remains 459. For 1 lakh EVM, it is 458. You have to sample only one less EVM, right? So the Election Commission of India went to the Supreme Court and said that 1 per assembly constituency is enough. And they were backed by some top-class statistician from India of very high repute who filed affidavits in the Supreme Court in support of ECI's claim. And they presumably went by this plot. And they said that if you take a parliamentary constituency, or if you take the whole country as a whole with 1.2 billion population, that's somewhere out there, or if you deploy so many EVMs, then collecting only about 400 EVMs is statistically auditing only about 400 EVMs is sufficient for the entire population, right? But the problem is that what should be the population? An assembly constituency has about 30 to 300 EVMs. A parliamentary constituency has about 300 to 18,000 EVMs. A state as a whole, depending on how large the state is, about 10,000 EVMs. And India as a whole has about 10 lakh EVMs. Right? In a parliamentary election, India as a whole deploys 10 lakh EVMs. So if you consider the entire India as a population, and say that 459 auditing 459 EVMs are sufficient, you are assuming a homogeneity across the entire country. You are assuming that your election subversion strategy in Kerala is exactly the same as the election subversion strategy in West Bengal, and is exactly the same as the election subversion strategy in Kashmir. right? But election results are declared in much smaller units. So if you go to a one assembly constituency and say that there are only 300 EVMs there, then you're in this zone. Then the curve shows that you will require to audit about 50% EVMs. If you are in a larger parliamentary constituency which has got about 1,000 EVM, then you have to, for the same certainty, you have to do about 40% EVM, 36.8% EVM needs to be statistically audited. So this claim that you need to, so ultimately the Supreme Court ruled that neither this way and not that way. Audit only 5 EVMs per assembly constituency, and that's the current practice. Now that has no statistical or logical basis. And what shows is an assembly constituency is typically of 1,000 EVM, then this detection should require at least 368 EVMs to be audited. Right? If you want to manually count, if you don't want to do a full VVPAT count, but only do a statistical count, then you have to pick up 368 EVMs from this and do a counting. So, and this is elementary. Any second-year engineering student should tell you, and Supreme Court should have used better judgment than to come up with a dictum and say that 5 EVMs per assembly constituency is sufficient. That doesn't seem to have any statistical basis. And in fact, as another deposition, this is probably by Professor Stark, he drew this table to show that if misreporting EVMs in a Lok Sabha constituency at 25%, then the Supreme Court's dictum will capture it with a virtual certainty. But if the misreporting EVM in a Lok Sabha constituency is only 1%, then you will detect it with only a probability 1/3, and you will miss it with the probability 2/3. Now that is not good statistics from Supreme Court of India, and this is something that the Commission very strongly objected to. So I think that blockchains. Let me see if I have the time for blockchains. Perhaps not. I think that Subodh has talked about blockchains already. I will just mention by saying that blockchain is a thing that the Commission also investigated, and the Commission's report we have published in India Forum article. And there is adequate, the conventional wisdom in computer science says that a blockchain-based election does not make any sense. A blockchain is a process that goes with distributed consensus. And when there is only one authority, the notion of a distributed consensus does not arise. So the US Academy of Sciences report has also cautioned against blockchain, saying that it's a hype that should be completely ignored, and this can have disastrous consequences for elections. The Citizens Commission of Election also makes the same recommendation. And I will not discuss this in great detail out there. So in a summary, it is well known that it is impossible to verify an electronic system as complicated as an EVM. So VVPATs are a must. If you use a VVPAT, then define which is the vote. The VVPAT is the vote, or the electronic button press is the vote correctly. And what should you do if they don't mismatch? Right? Leaving that undefined is not good for democracy. The VVPAT system should be voter verified. Not having the VVPAT system it's called voter verified paper audit trail. So not having it voter verified is a fundamental flaw. EVM audit by cross-checking with manual VVPAT, the Commission did not understand that why 100% VVPAT counting cannot be done. It seemed easy. But if you have to do a statistical audit, follow well-established statistical procedures. Don't arbitrarily declare 5 EVM should be audited per constituency. And blockchain really does not address the verifiability problem, either for electoral processes or for polling. Yes, so I'll stop here, and if there are questions, I'll try to take.
Thank you, Professor. Very enlightening, very clear presentation on the difficulties in designing these systems. And what you said, about machine readability of the VVPATs, etc., makes perfect sense. Why should it not be possible? So one question that comes to mind is that why the EVM should not record the vote rather than keep account of the votes. It can electronically, digitally record the votes in a random order in a stack, and the automatic reading of the VVPAT should be part of the transport of the slip itself into the vault. So as you see it going in, it should be read by the device, tallied against the vote which is digitally recorded, and then allowed to drop into the vault. This way, you will get votes in the vault that exactly match the recorded votes, and you can recount both anytime you wish. Of course, you will not have one-to-one correspondence between the slip and the electronic version. Can we do something like that?
There are two problems. One is that just the VVPAT matches the EVM does not give you a guarantee that the election was gone correctly, right? They just show that they both match. Yes. Why can't I delete 5 votes from both or add 5 votes into both, right? In favor of my political party. That's one. The second thing is that the reason the Indian EVM does not record identical votes, but just records an aggregate cumulative count, is because nobody can guarantee that the EVM will maintain secrecy, right? And the EVM leaking vote information is something that probably a risk that the ECI designers did not want to take. But indeed, the system that we have proposed, the cryptographic system, the EVM keeps a full record, and but EVM keeps a completely encrypted record. In fact, it is in computer science, almost all designs except 2 or 3 keeps the vote secret from the EVM. EVM getting to know the vote is an extremely problematic thing. So I like Shivam Shankar Singh made a statement that an EVM is reasonably safe if it is not connected. There can be no electronic equipment that is not connected. You are interacting with the environment through heat, through sound, through light. So there are hundreds of channels, and it's impossible to know that the electronic equipment is not shouting out in an unaudible band that Subodh has just voted for BJP, for example, right? And this can be communicated out. You don't need an internet for this. You can do it in the infrared band or the ultrasound band, or so. And I can hide an antenna in an electronic device that you cannot recognize even if you open it.
There is that famous case of a radiating antenna, which is not even electrically
transmitted. So I think that this is a false conception that a machine is not connected. A machine, if it is not connected, it does not exist. Like a human being is connected to other human beings, right? Otherwise, your machine is not breathing. So, machine getting to know the vote is a very big risk, and this risk is mitigated in Indian election by machine just keeping a count. But if the machine maintains a record, which is in one-to-one corresponding with the VVPAT, then the risk increases manifold, right? I think that the electronic, if you want to go that route, if you want to take that route, then you have to keep the vote secret from the EVM.
Yes.
And the best election is conducted if the EVM is a public machine. You take public laptops. In USA, elections are conducted using public laptops. You take them from schools and conduct an election. That's where there's the least chance of hacking. So you don't require the correctness of the machine to conduct an election correctly. You should be able to conduct on the polling officer's cell phone and using just an app. And those will be the perfectly correct election. So this, and that's what computer science has been advocating for a very long time. Somehow the Indian election system has not gone in that direction.
Thank you. Thanks. There is one interesting question from Mr. Barua, a comment rather, that in the 60s and 80s, people trusted the elections, though there was known booth capture and such other problems. Whereas today we have mistrust with EVMs and other things. So what is this? What's the reason?
I don't think that personally, this is something that we had a lot of debate in the Citizens Commission of Election. I personally don't think there's any reason to trust a paper-based election. There's no way to establish correctness of a paper-based voting system. And I disagree that this was trusted. I remember my father will always complain. I think that people like me who are brought up in Bengal, booth capturing is an art there.
Yes.
So people who did not support CPM complained for the last 40 years that they captured booths and manipulated elections. So I don't think that at least people in Bengal trusted paper-based election. No one should trust paper-based election. They're a dangerous thing. So elections should be electronic. There's no doubt about it. Just because the paper-based election should not be trusted. The Indian VVPAT system is actually, Indian EVM system is not bad actually. It is just that the VVPAT audit procedure is completely incorrect. Make that correct. It's a low-hanging fruit, and this becomes a good system. That's the recommendation of the Citizens Commission of Election.
Okay. There's a question addressed to both you and Professor Sharma by Shankar Singh. What do you think would be able to convey these concerns that you've articulated in a manner that the institution can take note of?
Okay, so I don't have any official contact with the Election Commission of India. Clearly, they don't officially listen.
Not just the Election Commission, but the entire apparatus that is concerned with this. From
I think that
parties to
I obviously being a part author of the report have spent some time on his understandability. Even within the Election Commission of India, I don't think that there is any problem with understandability. They completely understand what we are trying to say. Whether they want to act is a different matter altogether, or whether they want to acknowledge is a different matter altogether. So I think by and large, people who have read the report, this is not that difficult to understand. This is sort of straightforward, that if you are having a paper and an electronic and they're not in one-to-one correspondence, that you need to define which one is the vote. It's a simple English statement, right? So which one should you count? If paper is the vote, then why are you counting the electronic? And if electronic is the vote, then how is the paper auditing the electronic? At least these processes should be made clear. Right?
Perhaps what Mr. Shankar Singh is trying to do is to make the system listen, rather and understand, rather than
making the system listen is something that I try to leave it to Mr. Devashayam and Justice Madan Lokur, and
perhaps release white papers and hope that release as many white papers as possible, keep the discussion in active memory, and hope that enough people, a credible number of people, would take it up and force the system to acknowledge.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. There are other comments and questions, but I don't think we have the time. We are already at 5:40. We missed one break, but it was so interesting and engaging. So thanks to both of you. We'll take a 5 minutes break, not a 10-minute break, and then go to the last presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for overshooting, and sorry for overshooting.
No, not at all. It was very interesting. Thanks. Okay, so I welcome all of you back to the conference and to the last presentation this evening. This presentation is by Dr. Taha Ali, who's a professor at NUST, Institute of Information Technology, and he's an information security practitioner. Dr. Ali shall walk us through the history of attempts to adopt electronic voting in Pakistan. He sounds a caution about technology, fetishism, and mentions that electronic voting designs should only be adopted after due public consultation and after understanding the objectives that we are trying to address. That's the same kind of concern that Shivam Shankar also highlighted right in the beginning. So, without further delay, a request for this presentation by Dr. Taha Ali. I think there is some problem.
I think the recording is being pulled up and it'll get started.
Okay.
Right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Taha Ali. Title of my talk is Elections, Technology and the State, a Perspective from Pakistan. Sorry I can't be here in person for this talk, but I hope you find this interesting and worth your time. A bit of introduction about myself. So I am from Pakistan. I'm an assistant professor at NUST in Islamabad, National University of Sciences and Technology, Department of Electrical Engineering. My PhD is in network security from the University of New South Wales in Australia. And then I followed this up with a postdoc in 2014 in specifically looking at next generation electronic voting systems. I've also got a background in cryptocurrencies and the blockchain. And since 2016, so I've been in Pakistan since 2016, and I've been involved in the national activity on electronic voting. So there has been frantic activity over the last 5-6 years, and we stand at a pivotal point in time. And so I've authored research papers on this topic. In fact, one of the highlights of my career was a contribution to a book, which my research group was instrumental in putting together, my Newcastle research group. So this is real world electronic voting. So this brings together all the latest research on the new systems that are being built, secure and verifiable systems, which use cryptography. I've written newspaper articles. I've been part of several government committees. I've authored reports which have influenced the discourse. So my goal here in this talk is to bring you up to speed on what is happening in Pakistan. Like I said, there has been frantic activity over the last 6 years, and we are now at a historic point, actually. I'll get into that in a bit. And I hope to give you a personal perspective, as in more of an insider account, so you can see things from the inside. And many of these things you'll probably already know, but some of them will still be shocking for you or illuminating. And there are lessons to be learned here for developing countries, because from what I've read and what I've seen, election technology experiences in developing countries tend to have a lot of things in common. And you know what they say, that those who do not read history often end up repeating it. We have actually repeated history. We have repeated the mistakes made by other countries, and we might end up doing that again. So it's good to talk about these things so that people know and people find out and they can think more clearly. So a bit of humor. History repeats itself. Yes. And every time it does, the price goes up. And this actually happens too. I can testify to this from personal experience. So anyway, so before we get into what is happening on the ground here, I'd like to clarify my stance. And this, I believe, is the stance of the majority, the overwhelming majority of the election technology community today, to which I belong, which is that technology can be a viable and promising option for elections. It can be very useful. It has several good qualities, advantages, but deployments must not be done in haste. When you approach election technology, you have to exercise caution and skepticism, because what happens is that when you bring in technology to fix a problem, the technology can end up creating problems itself. And sometimes those problems can outweigh the initial problem. And then what people tend to do is they tend to bring in more technology to fix those problems, and you get into this vicious circle, spiral of sorts. So this is well known. There are lots of papers written on this. This is well known in the literature. If you look at any handbook on expert guidelines or best practices for elections, the one thing they make clear is don't rush into this. Do your homework, go slow, scale up gradually, address challenges as they arise. So that is what I'm saying here as well. And that new technologies should be deployed for transparency and security, things like verifiable voting, risk limiting audits. I believe there are calls in India for these as well. You've probably already heard Subhashis talk at this forum. Great care, effort, and deliberation is required for the ecosystem. So technology requires an ecosystem around it. So you have lots of things around it. There are human factors, socio-political things, dispute resolution mechanisms, how to handle technologies, procedures, lots of things. And this effort is often underestimated. Sometimes the effort and costs of the ecosystem can actually outweigh those of the technology itself. So this has to be factored in. And there is a critical lack of expertise and processes in Pakistan. So no one knows anything about election technology. Absolutely no one. There is, and this is pretty much in many countries, unfortunately. And we do not have, more important, we lack the processes to talk about election technology. Like we lack the forums and uh, we lack the knowledge of how to go about building our expertise. And we are often in denial, at least from what I've seen over the last 6 years. Almost all the stakeholders I talk to, they are in denial that this gap even exists. For them, elections is just an IT problem. Yeah, bring in IT to fix it. Yes, but IT doesn't fix it. Okay, fine, bring in blockchain, that will fix it. So we need to confront these challenges. We need to take ownership of them. We need to recognize them, and then we need to address them. And they can be addressed. That is what I believe as well. So that is my stance, and that is the stance I'll take throughout this talk. So the turning point for Pakistan, for elections in Pakistan, was 2013. So the prior elections prior to 2013, we've had quite a few, they were problematic, but they were mostly peaceful, and they were low stakes. Low stakes in the sense that you had two political parties, and they would just swap every election. It would be one or the other, and you knew that. And there would be some rigging, but it wasn't too much, or it wasn't too obvious. The 2013 polls were historic for three reasons. The first reason was that this was the first, in all of Pakistan's 70 plus years of history, this was the first election where you were having a transition from a democratically elected government to another democratically elected government. Right? Before that, what had happened was that either democratic governments had been overthrown by military coups, or what happened is that the president would dissolve the assemblies and would basically dissolve the government and call for new elections. This was the first transition from democracy to democracy. So this was historic in that sense. The second reason was that for the first time, the pattern of the two-party pattern was broken. A third party had emerged, and this was the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which was led by Imran Khan. You might know the former cricketer, philanthropist, and a very charismatic and new faces. And he completely galvanized the discourse. They changed everything, and there was this wave of change, tabdili, which was due to come. So everyone was very excited. And that's why we had 55% voter turnout in these elections, which is again historic. I think this was the largest turnout since the 70s. So this was a big deal. And the third reason why these polls were historic also was because these elections were a nightmare in terms of how they were conducted, and the rigging and the fraud. And so let me get into that. So the election watchdog body, so these were the most controversial elections we've had also in 40 to 50 years. So the election watchdog body at the time, FAFN, Free and Fair Election Network, they've done some fantastic work in Pakistan. They recorded some over 71,000 irregularities. Right? And there were all sorts of irregularities. There was weak polling station management. Polling staff were doing things they should not be doing. Ballot boxes, breach of protocols. Ballot boxes were being brought in and the seals were already broken. There was ballot stuffing. Some constituencies recorded more votes cast than actual voters on the election rolls. There were over 288 recorded incidences of violence. Some of it was severe. Some people were killed. There was poor results management. I'll get into the result management in a bit. This was a big factor in what happened. The polling workers were submitting precinct results handwritten on paper, normal pieces of paper, not on the letterhead or the actual forms. And the forms which were supposed to consolidate the precinct level results, in many cases, the totals did not add up. In some cases, the seals were missing, the signatures were missing. There was no provenance or no accounting for how these forms were managed. It was a nightmare. So right after the elections, there were allegations of massive organized rigging. 21 political parties claimed that rigging had happened. The election tribunals were packed with complaints. They were overflowing with complaints. Then a whistleblower emerged from within the election commission who said that yes, massive rigging, lots and lots and lots of rigging. The chief election commissioner resigned, and later on he revealed that he resigned because the judiciary would not let him investigate these claims of massive rigging. The NADRA chairman resigned. So NADRA is the National Database Registration Authority. So they assist the election commission with technology matters, and they maintain and with the electoral rolls. They assist them. and they had a role in designing the election protocol. The chairman was a very active figure. He tried to investigate this fraud himself. He held a few press conferences. Then, in the middle of the night, he was fired suddenly by the government. And he went to the Islamabad High Court and he got his job back. But then he claims he started to receive threats, he and his family, and so he resigned and left the country. So this was a complete disaster, and you had failures at almost every possible level. It was a collapse. Your election administration collapsed, your checks and balances collapsed, the dispute resolution mechanisms collapsed, the judicial mechanisms collapsed. Parliament refused to investigate. So the tribunals were packed with complaints, but it started to take years. It took almost months and months, up to a year, for the complaints, and they were still not resolved because that system, that process itself was broken. So Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, again, Imran Khan's party, they decided to do something about this, and they released a white paper of 2,100 pages with evidence, affidavits, copies of the forms, lots and lots of evidence. And then, after 1 year of basically exhausting all possible avenues to get redress, they decided to launch a political movement to get an investigation into what happened. So they launched the Freedom March, Azadi March, and they started with protest rallies in large cities, and then culminated in a sit-in in Islamabad. And this again was a historic sit-in. This was the largest sit-in Pakistan's history. It got worldwide attention. The people actually lived there. They set up tents and trailers and right in front of Parliament, and they would sleep there. They would cook food there. There would be everyday people would from Islamabad would go over to join them in solidarity. There would be speeches. The entire news cycle, 9 to 5 media cycle, was completely disrupted. It was focusing on those protests. There were speeches every night, fiery speeches. So things were at a fever pitch, right? And this protest was so huge, it cost estimated losses of $5 million afterwards, it was discovered, in terms of lost productivity and stalemate. So there was a stalemate because the key demand of the protesters was that the prime minister should resign, and then there should be an independent investigation into what went wrong in the elections. And the prime minister, on the other hand, Nawaz Sharif, he said that, all right, you can have your independent investigation, but I'm not going to resign. And this went back and forth for quite a while, and neither party was budging. Then the stalemate was broken. A terrorist attack happened in 2015. This was on the army public school, and it was allegedly the Taliban. They burst in, and there were 150 casualties, almost all of them students and teachers. And this was horrific, the attack itself. And overnight, the entire discourse changed. And the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, they called off the sit-in in the interest of, as a show of national solidarity with the government. And the government and the opposition, they got together to tackle terrorism. But they made it clear that this matter was not over. And shortly afterwards, the Judicial Inquiry Commission was formed to investigate these rigging allegations. And side by side, a parliamentary committee was working on electoral reforms. So this is what was happening. Then the Judicial Commission did an inquiry and they cleared the elections. This was surprising. It was not a very satisfying result, but the conclusion they drew was that elections are definitely broken. They said the opposition parties were justified in calling for an investigation. It was very justified. But while there were problems and incidents, there was no proof of necessarily what you can call organized rigging. So there was a bit of semantics here as well. And they said that yes, by and large, the elections did sort of reflect the public will. And the spotlight then turned from rigging, it turned onto the election commission. The report made clear that the election commission had failed here. They had failed to administer the elections. They were the weakest link in the chain. They had failed to have any accountability. They had completely failed. And in response to this, then the parliamentary committee came out with the Elections Reform Bill of 2017. And this bill was designed to empower the election commission, to make it more independent and autonomous. So they were now given the powers of a high court and they were given greater freedom in terms of flexibility for financial matters, in terms of administrative rights and duties. And they also called, the bill also called for a transparent results management system. Because one thing that had emerged in this judicial commission in the inquiry was that this result management system, this had failed catastrophically. So what happens in Pakistan is you've got these precinct level counts, which are documented in what we call Form 14s. Every precinct, when the polls close, they document their totals in a Form 14. And then these forms are collected at the district level, and their totals are organized in something called a Form 19. And as per the Election Commission's protocol, after the elections, they were supposed to post all of these forms online so that everyone could see there was transparency into what was happening. But the Judicial Commission found that about 30% of Pakistan's Form 14s were missing. They could not be accounted for. We didn't know where they were. And this was scandalous. I mean, this was catastrophic. And then several of the Form 19s, their totals did not meet with what did not match what the Form 14s were saying. So there was a big fiasco. And so they called for a transparent results management system. And this bill also called for piloting electronic voting machines and biometric voting machines. And this was the time that I also returned to Pakistan in 2016, and I contributed a couple of articles to this discourse. And this was the same stance that yes, machines have a lot of advantages, but they do not solve all your problems. And there is a lot of technology fetishization involved here, which we have to be careful about. And then I talked a bit about mistakes other countries have made, and so on and so forth. And then the ECP, Election Commission of Pakistan, they reached out to certain universities in Islamabad for a potential collaboration R&D to modernize Pakistan's voting systems. And I was part of these discussions. We met for like almost a year, and we hammered out action plans and things like these. But then those talks fizzled out for some reason or the other. And then the attention shifted to internet voting for overseas citizens. Right? So this time again, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf took the lead. They went to the Supreme Court and they petitioned the Supreme Court to order the Election Commission to empower, to enfranchise overseas citizens using internet voting. Now, Pakistan's constitution does allow for overseas citizens to vote. It is recognized as a fundamental right. The moral argument here is that Pakistan, a big bulk of Pakistan's GDP is actually depends on the remittances sent by these overseas workers to Pakistan, and therefore they should at least have some representation in parliament. So that was the argument. But for a very long time, the argument put forward by the Election Commission was that we don't have the means to do this. So they tried piloting postal voting and telephone voting, but those mechanisms, according to their reports, had failed. And they said that internet voting is not reliable yet. So the Supreme Court then asked NADRA, again the database authority, can you help with an internet voting system? And NADRA said, yes, we can. So in 10 weeks, they put together something called iVote, an internet voting system. And the Supreme Court unveiled this system in 2018, about 5 months before the election. They called in civil society, the politicians, all the stakeholders, academia, the media, and the system was unveiled, and this was called iVote. And at that meeting, the academics, including myself, we raised a vigorous protest. We said that this system, from what we can see, it seems to be repeating all the mistakes made by earlier such systems. And it seems that the people who've made the system, they're not aware that all such systems in the past have failed. They have failed in very, very obvious ways. And I can see from the screen that, from the PowerPoint presentation that is presented, that this system has those same mistakes. In fact, one of the things I talked about was that iVote, if someone had bothered to Google iVote, you would discover that iVote is actually the name of Australia's system, which was the largest internet voting system at the time. And that had failed. And it had failed, and this system was basically using the same model. So based on these discussions, the Supreme Court then set up an internet voting task force to assess the system and check if it was ready to use in the elections, if it was suitable for use. And I was part of this task force as well, along with other technologists, people from other universities, from provincial technology boards, and we were given 45 days to look at the system. So there's just a brief summary of our findings, the main findings. So, the obvious hiccup, which everyone is aware of, I hope, is that when you vote, when you take voting outside of the polling booth into some remote setting, then there is no privacy, right? You cannot guarantee that a person will vote a certain way. For instance, I might be standing here, I might force my wife to vote a certain way. My wife might force me to vote a certain way. So, and an employer might force his employee to vote a certain way. And these fears are not unfounded in the sense that what happens, Pakistan's overseas diaspora, a lot of it is concentrated in the Middle East. Right? And in the Middle East, the relationships between employees and employers are very complex. The employers are usually Middle East citizens of Middle East countries, and they hold the passports of their employees. That's the normal practice, and they are able to force them to work in certain conditions which others object to, which people find objectionable. So there is a lot of pressure there, and there is a lot of potential for this kind of coercion, voter coercion. And then we found certain very standard flaws, which are not surprising at all. We found that we could do phishing attacks. We could send emails pretending to be the election commission, which reroute the voters, legitimate voters, to our websites, which look like election websites. And basically, we steal their votes and their voting credentials. This has happened in the past for a long time. Companies have pretended to be government websites, Pakistani government websites, for a long time. And it has proved very, very difficult for government bodies in Pakistan to get these websites down because they're based overseas. And this has been happening for a long time. Then there's the standard man in the middle attack. In fact, what happens here is that so a standard practice when you set up a website or a web service is that to prevent denial of service attacks, you don't route website traffic directly to your website. You route it through a filtering service like Cloudflare or Akamai. And they have very large data centers. So if there's a lot of spam and malicious traffic coming in, they filter it out and then they send you the useful traffic. Right? And that is what this voting system did as well. But as researchers have found in the past, that when you use this kind of solution, then you are trusting this body, this middleman, to actually look at your votes, to maybe even change them, and then forward them on to you. And you don't have visibility into this process. And many of these organizations like Cloudflare, they're not based in Pakistan. Their servers are overseas. They're subject to foreign laws in foreign jurisdictions. So we don't have this kind of control over them. And elections are sensitive. You can do other things. You can entrust other activities, but not critical activities, to this kind of a setup. And then we found certain very careless flaws. We found a 1-for-2 flaw, which is a bit eye-opening. So basically, when you log on to the system, you can cast 2 votes. As an overseas voter, I can vote for 1 National Assembly seat and 1 Provincial Assembly seat. Let's say I've got National Assembly NA 125 and Provincial Assembly 35, PA 35. NA 125, PA 35. But if I go into my browser and I click Inspect Elements and I open up the raw HTML code, then within minutes I can make changes. It literally takes 2 minutes. And then I can vote for any 2 seats of my choice. Like, let's say NA 250, 2 votes, gone and counted. And this was shocking. Basically, there was no security sensibility. Basically, you had 2 people who had done some IT work in the past. They had met and they decided, oh, let's build a voting system. And this is the kind of voting system you would get in this case. There was no security sensibility. Obsolete components had been used, old database technologies which had been hacked, captchas which had already been broken. And what was really eye-opening to me was that there was no homework done in this case. Now, this system was going to be the largest internet voting system in the world. The largest voting system before this, the Australian voting system, the iVote, had catered to about 200 to 300 voters at that time, 200 to 300,000 voters, 200 to 300,000. This was going to cater to 6 to 7 million voters. Right? So this is equivalent to climbing Mount Everest, but you haven't even done any basic homework. You haven't even climbed some neighborhood hill or the Margala Hills of Islamabad. You have no idea, you have no background in this area, and now you're suddenly within 5 months, with 4 months to go, you want to ascend Mount Everest. So this was eye-opening to me that this kind of gap, cognitive dissonance existed. And then there was no recognition that there was an ecosystem involved in this process. For instance, we had interviews with all of the stakeholders. So we went to the people who built the system and we said, all right, so this system has this component, and this component. Who's going to take care of this component? Who's going to take care of this? Where is this going to be housed? Who's going to talk to who? What are the procedures? What are the security clearances going to be? Who are the people? How many employees do you have? None of that homework had been done. They thought that, all right, we've got this thing up and running. That's it. Now somehow everything is going to fix itself, or we can fix it at the last minute. And this was shocking to me as well. And then the worst thing was that there was no concept of best practices, standard practices. Like I'm sure there are many technologists here who are listening to this talk. And for instance, when you go to build a house, you don't bring the bricks and you start building the house. First, you go to an architect and you come up with a blueprint, right? A map, an architectural diagram. And this blueprint has all the details of the house. It has the doors, the number of rooms, the height, the width, everything. So you can actually see the house before it is built. And in the development community, the equivalent we have is something called a software requirements specification. Before you build a piece of software, you document the essential features of that software so that later on, if you have a dispute, both parties have this to refer to, that all right, I was supposed to do this and I did this. And then you can also visualize what you're going to get, the output, right? Now this is a standard practice. We teach it at university. Every student who makes a final year project, the first thing he has to submit an SRS. But in this case, this was a 150 million rupees project. There was no SRS. There was no recognition of the need for an SRS. So we were really at rock bottom. And so our recommendation, the committee's recommendation was that, in fact, let me see if I have that. Okay, no, I don't. So the committee's recommendation, we wrote a detailed report on this, and our recommendation was that the Election Commission of Pakistan invest on a critical basis. They invest in a research and development wing, so that they could look at new technologies, they could look at best practices, they could guide the national discourse, they could basically they could inform the discourse. Right now, everything was going in the dark. We literally had the case of the blind leading the blind. That's one intellectual called it that. He said, in most policy, we actually have the scenario is it's blind leading the blind. And this is an unfortunate reality. And this is not just specific to Pakistan. This is a common problem across the developing world. And if you look at election technology experiences in the developing world, most of those are just white elephants. You bring in very expensive technology, and then you realize it doesn't work. And there are even worse stories than this. I think it was Namibia or Nigeria, one of these countries. So they got these very fancy biometric. Yes, sorry, it was Kenya. They got very fancy biometric voting machines, which was state of the art, top of the line, and then they deployed them. And then on election day, they discovered that, all right, the batteries have run out, and these plugs, the polling places, aren't equipped with power sockets. So we can't really run these machines. And in midday, they had to switch to. So this is basic, the homework that needs to be done when you try to deploy technology. The technology itself is one component. The ecosystem is generally ignored, and that can prove fatal. So we delivered this report in 2018, and in 2019 and 2020, activity started again towards getting an election technology system up and running. In 2020, so I was asked to join several committees, lots and lots and lots of committees. And basically, I must have attended over 100 meetings, at least 150 meetings. I mean, there were days when every day of the week, we were having meetings. It was either this ministry, that ministry, president subcommittee, this forum, that forum, and I was giving talks on what we should be doing, how we should be going ahead. And so at that point in time, the message I was giving, I've made dozens of presentations, dozens and dozens. Like, I've given lots of presentations, but I've actually physically prepared dozens and dozens of PowerPoint slides for this audience, that audience, this topic, that topic. And the message was consistently the same, that there is a lot of homework to do and we must not underestimate election technology. We must not rush into it. But unfortunately, I was not having much luck. And bit by bit, I was gently nudged out of all of these committees. So at first, people would be very receptive to what I had to say, but then when it became clear that this was a colossal amount of effort, literally a mountain of effort, then people would start to sour on the whole idea. And so this is how the meetings would normally go. So almost 99.99% of the time would be spent on high-level discussions and thought experiments, and there would not be. We wouldn't have any. The discussions would generally not be rooted in actual ground realities of election technology or the complexities. We would not. We would not be discussing new technologies. There would be no talk of risk limiting audits or how to build machines and developing indigenous expertise. Uh, there have hardly been any pilots conducted. There's been no capacity building, no talk of best practices. So we are still where we were 3 years ago in 2018 when we submitted our report on iVoting. And basically where we were then was basically we were at least 10 years ago. In terms of the global experience, I think we're still at in the early 2000s. So 10 to 15 years. So this is where we are today. All of these meetings, there were some positives. I met some very interesting people. That's how I discovered the Hasgeek community. We've started some nice collaborations. I discovered some people reached out. We authored some research papers. A few of us, we managed to raise research funding. So now we have the semblance of a research group. That myself and 2 or 3 students of mine, a handful of students, some working on a volunteer basis. So now we have a small community where we are actually we are trying to start on the big homework assignment that has to be done for election technology. I've written lots and lots of articles on this. They have thankfully they've managed to make a dent in the national discourse. Now there is talk of an ecosystem. NADRA has recognized that there is something called end-to-end verifiable voting. So that is good. But there is still this huge gap. Like in Pakistan, we still do not have any organization or any entity which can talk authoritatively about election technology. We don't have this. So we are not that organization. So my research group, we've tried to make a start at this by we've launched a web presence on Twitter called Pivot, promoting innovative voting technologies. Where what we try to do is we try to comment or provide, we try to deconstruct or break down what is happening in the election technology ecosystem. In fact, we post stories of interest to Pakistan. For instance, we posted on the news articles on the Russian voting system that failed, the Moscow blockchain-based voting system, which elections I think happened last month, and last week iVote, Australia's iVote system again collapsed in mid-election. So we sort of try to raise awareness about these things and point to the way forward. And then last month we had a landmark development again. So the government actually amended the Elections Act 2017, and now they have mandated the deployment of electronic voting machines and internet voting in the next general elections of 2023. So that's about a year and a half away. So this is where we are. So this is, like I said, this is a historic point. We are at a crossroads. So the government is convinced that so this amendment is extremely controversial. The opposition parties resisted it vigorously. The Election Commission resisted it vigorously. Civil society organizations, election watchdog bodies, they advised against it. Only the government was behind it, and the government managed to bulldoze it through Parliament. They had the numbers, so they managed to pass it. And they are convinced. From my dealings with them, I believe they are convinced that this is the way forward. Though this is also a failure of the election technology community, of people like myself. We have failed to convince the government that. So when you have large-scale deployments of election technology, typically it takes at least 4 to 8 years to scale up to fully. And this is two such deployments. So when if these deployments happen, this will be perhaps the largest deployment of internet voting in the world, and it'll be the second or third largest deployment of machines in the world. And with this kind of a setup, if you're rushing into projects like these, national infrastructure projects on a global scale, you would expect that there would be tons of homework. There would be a whole bookshelf filled with feasibility studies, pilot reports, manuals, design specifications, environmental impact studies, procedural mechanisms, legal requirements, all sorts of things, commentaries. But there is nothing. There is no paperwork on this, nothing at all. So this is historic. So now we're at a point where we have to decide, Pakistan has to decide, are we going to, what are we going to do? Are we going to challenge this in court? The Election Commission might challenge this amendment in court. The opposition might challenge it in court and get a stay or at least a delay. The Election Commission might decide to go ahead. They might bring in all these machines. Then we might be set up for another Kenya type disaster where we haven't done the homework and then we have a catastrophic systems failure on election day, which is in the whole world can see what is happening. Or this could be the start of a healthy engagement with technology where we decide that, all right, now we're going to get our act together. We're going to invest in R&D. We're going to go step by step. We're going to follow this process through to the end. And this is actually the reason I'm not able to deliver this talk in person. I'm part of the Election Commission's technical, they have a technical committee, and we have a meeting at the time of this talk. It's one of these critical strategy meetings. So I have to attend, and we're formulating policy. I would request all of you to pray for us. Let's see what happens. So the estimated cost of this deployment of just the electronic voting machines is about 150 billion rupees for nationwide deployment. So we cannot afford to get something like this wrong. But the reality is, as I have explained, we have no homework and we've got only 1.5 years. No country has been able to deploy to this scale in 1.5 years. No country that I know of. So anyway, that is where we are. And this is, I believe, a failure of the election technology community. And so I'm about to wrap up. What I want to talk about is that there is this big disconnect between our community and the general public, the stakeholders. For the stakeholders, there is no problem. Election technology is not a big deal, right? It's not. I mean, the most obvious question I get is, if I can bank online, why can't I vote online, right? And election technology is simply an IT problem. Right? That's how the world, that's how people see it, and that this is how they see it in the West as well. Up until very recently, this is what, if you went to the U.S. states, they have state level election boards in the United States. And if you talk to their administrators, they would say, yeah, just election technology, it's an IT problem. Let's bring in the IT people. And then many of these meetings, the commissions, I showed you a long list of committees that I joined, they would have a small technical group. I would be part of that technical group, but the other people would always be an IT expert, a software developer, or an electronics expert. Some of them would be very good people I have great respect for, but they would have no inkling of what election technology is or what can be done, right? Or what has been done. They would have no idea that of the failures of the Australian system, the Estonian system, what went wrong in Kenya, what went wrong in Germany, the Netherlands. They have no idea. They haven't seen, they haven't read about the hacks into the Indian voting machines. They don't know who many of these people are. So there is this big disconnect. And I would have to spend a lot of time trying to explain that, no, this is like if you want to launch a space program, or if you want to build a nuclear power plant, or you don't bring in an IT person or a database person to advise you on space technology, right? Likewise, for election technology, you need to build this expertise, or at least bring in consultants or experts who can advise in this domain. But there, the whole point was that, oh no, IT can fix it. And then these buzzwords, AI and blockchain, made everything worse, because, the point of view would be, if it can't be fixed by IT, let's bring in blockchain. That will definitely fix everything, right? And that would obviously, this would be very, very frustrating for me for a long time, Only recently I've started to get over this and see it as an opportunity. But what I want to get across is that this communication gap is very genuine, it is very real, and people like us who are working in this domain, who want to help with election technology in our respective countries, our first goal should be to bridge this gap, right? And I'll tell you how I have had some luck in bridging it, and maybe that can help you as well. So this is a cartoon which you've probably seen it before, which is pretty much along the same lines. So aircraft designers, when you talk to them about airplane safety, they say, yeah, but the chances are very low. It's wonderful. It's super safe. And if you ask people who build elevators, the engineers say, oh yeah, the elevators are perfect. They're nearly incapable of falling. But when you ask software engineers about computerized voting, electronic voting, they say, oh, no, that's terrifying. Don't ever do that. And then when you get into more details, they say, yeah, don't trust voting software. Don't listen to anyone who tells you it's safe. We are terrible at what we do. Everything will go wrong if you use electronic voting. And then you say, oh, but blockchain takes care of everything. I say, no. Keep away from it. Bury it in the desert. Wear gloves. It's all wrong. It's all wrong. So this gap is very, very real, right? So I've started to see it as an opportunity. If someone says, if I can bank online, can I vote online? I ask them to sit down and then I give me 5 minutes of their time. And then I go into what the difference between banking online and voting online is. And I believe that if you can explain this properly to the other side, if you can connect with them on this, if you can convince them of this, that these are different problems, then things become much easier, right? And then you have a real chance of impacting the mainstream consciousness. And the way to do that is you talk about how banking online is different from voting online. And this is how it is really different in that when you bank online or when you use an ATM machine, everything is logged, right? Everything has to be logged. The moment you slide in the card, that is logged, your password is logged. The moment you make a transaction, the amount is logged, the interbank mechanism, the movement of the money, that is logged. Everything is logged. And it has to be logged. It has to be logged so that the money can be protected, right? So if something goes wrong, you can raise a complaint, you can even get your money back. If your account gets hacked, the funds can be traced. So you have to have logging. Everything has to be fully recorded, otherwise the system falls apart. But you can't do that with elections. Because when you start recording things in elections, you forfeit the privacy of the vote. Because when you cast a vote, all identifying information is stripped away from the vote. And this has to be because privacy is the fundamental principle, the bedrock of free and fair elections. It is in the UN Human Declaration of Human Rights. It has been known for over a millennia. The Greeks, the Romans, even the Indians used to have this concept of secrecy of the ballot. So when you remove all identifying information from a vote, this is an interesting thought experiment. Can you track the vote? Can you protect the vote? You can do that in a physical setting, like when you slide your ballot into a physical ballot box, when you slide the paper in, you effectively anonymize it, right? And then you keep an eye, you put a camera, you train a camera on the ballot box, and you make sure no one tampers with it, right? But you can't do that with a machine because a machine is technically a black box. Things go in, things come out. You don't know what is happening inside the machine. You don't. This is the reason that Germany, Netherlands, so many other countries, Ireland, they phased out, they terminated their electronic voting deployments. And other countries like Finland, the UK, France, etc., they just chose not to jump into this. They chose not to open this Pandora's box. And this, I believe, it is easy once you put the argument like this in front of people, it is easy to convince them to get them to see what is happening. And then you can build on it. You can say that because you have this black box, the system is actually more vulnerable to fraud than a paper-based system. Because in a black box, you can write computer code that can manipulate votes without being detected. That has been done. These attacks have been demonstrated in the US. Likewise, you can have retail fraud. Like in paper-based elections, it takes a bit of effort to manipulate one vote. To manipulate 1,000 votes or 10,000 votes, you have to do a lot of physical effort. You have to you have to capture a polling station, you have to capture a ballot box, you have to spend all night, you have to have a coffee machine running, you have to spend all night manipulating the ballots, and these things can be discovered. But to manipulate 1,000 votes in an electronic voting machine, you just have to press a single button. right? There have been attacks which have shown that all you have to do is you just slide in, you just walk up to a voting machine, you slide in a USB, in 1 minute you take it out, the votes have been manipulated. That's it. So this is called retail fraud, like wholesale fraud in bulk. You just one step, thousands of votes manipulated. Likewise, you often go up to ATMs and you might discover the ATM is out of business, right? It might be down, the link might be down. You walk up to another ATM, you use that. In the sense, you might log on to your internet banking portal, the portal might be down. You log on 20 minutes later, the portal is up, right? But with elections, you don't have that luxury. The machines have to work on election day and they have to be available. If they go down, that immediately casts a whole cloud of suspicion on the elections, right? Likewise, there are incidents, and how you recover from incidents. Like, for instance, if my banking account gets hacked, there is a whole audit trail. Investigators can follow up and they might be able to recover my funds. I can even protect myself. I can get insurance against banking fraud, right? But there is no such equivalent for elections. I can't get insurance against a fraudulent election. And in many cases, the attackers, people who hack elections, the goal might not be to manipulate votes. It might just be to cast suspicion on results. Like if we knock off a results transmission system, or if we knock off the online voting website for 4 hours, we can cast genuine suspicion on the elections. That is, in a sense, an election. It's not only that the election must be fair, it must be seen to be fair. And if it is not seen to be fair, it is technically a failed election. So this is very important. And likewise, then banks, elections, when you hold them, so they are national level, infrastructure level projects. They attract a whole different class of attacker, elite intelligence agencies. So now you're in the domain of cyber warfare. Banks are not subject to cyber warfare. Online banking, they're not. But elections are. And you might be aware that in 2017, the US Department of Homeland Security, they officially designated their election systems as critical infrastructure in the same class as dams or power grids, in the sense that if you attack election systems, that might be declared an act of war. It might be considered an act of war. And likewise, these attackers have resources that we cannot even imagine, unlimited resources. And for instance, one capability they have is something called zero-day attacks. What these agencies do, they look at popular software and they document certain flaws, they find certain flaws, but they don't announce them publicly. They hoard them. And then when they have enough, they put together an attack using those flaws and they launch that attack. And the effect is devastating because technically the person who is attacked, the party that is attacked, has 0 days to recover from the flaw because they have no idea this flaw even existed. So when the Iranian nuclear reactors were attacked, that attack had 4 zero-day flaws in Windows. It was unprecedented. And it set the nuclear program back by a few years. And in 2015, researchers demonstrated zero-day attacks on New South Wales iVote voting system. So this is, we have the proof of concept. These attacks are very real. So if this argument is followed, you do manage to have common ground with, you make some progress on overcoming the cognitive dissonance that exists between the technology community and the general stakeholders, the politicians, the media, the general public, the watchdog bodies, civil society. So this is something that I've had a lot of luck with. And I'm going to conclude now because I think I'm out of time. So the conclusion here is, this is a very positive thing which I've discovered only in the last year as well, that when you try to genuinely connect with the stakeholders, when you meet them on their own terms, when you engage with them with their dialogue, that itself, that leads to visible results, visible progress. And apparently the research literature suggests that this actually is also good. It leads to more fruitful outcomes using election technology as well. So this is this is a very nice paper, one of my favorite papers from this domain, Digital Dilemmas. It's a study of election technology deployments in African countries. And they looked at what failed and what worked. And a lot of things failed. And they found that, unsurprisingly, the greatest gains from digitization come from countries where the quality of democracy is higher and the election commission is more independent. Because when the stakeholders, when they genuinely understand technology and they have the means to discuss it and debate it, then they come up with solutions which make more sense, which are more transparent, and they also take ownership of those solutions. So what happens also as well is that in the event of a mishap, there is less finger pointing and there is more movement towards a solution. So we don't, people who are working in this domain, people like myself, we don't just have to push forward the right technology. We should try to inculcate a democratic culture. We should go about it in a democratic manner, which means that we should sit down with the stakeholders, we should look them in the eye, we should respect their integrity as individuals, and we should engage with them honestly. We should try to change their minds, but we should be open to the possibility of our own minds being changed as well. And so this is what I have to say. And this is what I'm going to be trying at what I have been trying for a while now, and what I'll be trying at our meeting. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'm sorry I'm not here to answer questions. And thank you for your time, and I'll hopefully see you again soon. Thank you.
So that was Dr. Taha Ali. Very fascinating story that he had to tell us, and a very passionate delivery. Because he's obviously very passionate about what he does. Although he's not here and therefore cannot take the questions right now, any questions or concerns that are put in the chat will be shared with him, and perhaps we can get it back on our project page as Impression has suggested. Let me take just a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes of your time to share what I heard the speakers say. Starting with Shivam Shankar, who had fabulous stories and raised very thought-provoking questions about the complexity of the election, whether we understand it fully or not, before we attempt to change anything. And the important point he made was that we should not have a false objective, whether speed or lower costs are the considerations. We cannot have those considerations. We can have only one consideration, and because otherwise, subsidiary objectives will take over. And in his words, making the election fair and more democratic. If that is the objective, that's a good objective, and technology and all other efforts should be aligned in that direction, and in no other, because the other objectives should not be allowed to subvert the main task that we have with the elections. However, even if we select the right objective, we cannot be lax. We have to evaluate the risk. You mentioned a lot of them: hacking, loss of secrecy, analytics, and targeting of people. The problem of bias, which isn't always so obvious in technology, and the problem of trust that Mansi brought up. All these problems will have to be examined, even if we design a system to deliver on the objective that we all agree. So first is, what is the most important thing? When we only do that, and even then, we should not give up due diligence, as it is. He shared that when he saw Facebook become big, he thought it would reduce the cost for the political parties, but it actually increased the costs, because that's what technology does. It's very difficult to predict where it will take us, and therefore no amount of diligence is actually a waste. Dr. Subodh Sharma provided a theoretical framework for judging the suitability of voting systems, and he walked us through details of some of those systems. Very illustrative and worth going into all those systems in detail, because of the importance of thinking through. And each of those systems help us think through individual problems that they are designed to solve. None of them, however we saw, can solve all the problems. Dr. Subhashis Banerjee, of course, is always very clear in his presentation, and he helped us see the system we follow currently and what we could do to improve it. He shared the recommendations of the Citizens Commission on Elections and the insights that went into the formulation of its recommendations. So that was very useful. Of course, and then finally we had Taha with the story of the pulls and pressures that every institution in this country had to deal with in holding and preserving an election. And he shared how big the gaps were between what the elections were supposed to do or what they supposedly do and what the reality was found to be. And in that situation, it's not unreasonable for people to look towards technology for solutions. Now, whether technology can actually solve those problems is far from obvious, as he has pointed out. And that is why the evaluation of the technology and all the approaches is needed. He mentioned about overseas voter being allowed to vote over the internet, which by itself is problematic, as many have pointed out. I mean, it can be done in small numbers for a few people, but it cannot be a large scale thing at all. And other problems that he mentioned, of course, were related to technology processes and can perhaps be solved. But whatever the architecture is, whatever the code is, it has to be open to public scrutiny. And that means all the code, including what is part of the firmware of the equipment. So I think there is no getting away from evaluating this and doing the homework. I think the takeaways for me is that we have to choose the right reasons. We cannot let the main objective, which is to conduct a fair election, be subverted by other considerations. And we have to have the right process, which is consultative and collaborative, where everybody who can contribute to solving the problem is encouraged to come together, is welcomed, and their contributions are integrated. And then we see if we can improve on a system, or whether we should maybe leave it alone for the time being. But technology tends to move forward, and we can't really ignore it. And therefore, the need to actually do an evaluation and all the hard work that was mentioned by Dr. Taha becomes so important. So thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for letting me share my thoughts here and for inviting me to this conversation. And I would like to thank them for the very important work that they are doing on behalf of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we all wrap up, I just want to point out that we will continue to organize more of these conversations as we lead up to a conference that is coming up in January. Please do register and subscribe to the project page to receive the updates. The talks of today, from today, would be uploaded to the YouTube channel, and we will be taking some time to summarize and extract some of the key points and also post to our project page. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.